Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
Chapter 1. Transmigrated as Soldier Boy. Cold. Bone-chilling cold. Kevin struggled to regain a trace of consciousness in the pitch darkness. He felt his limbs as heavy as lead. There even seemed to be some kind of metal mask over his mouth, restricting his breathing. As he instinctively struggled, he forced open his heavy eyelids with great effort. The next moment, Kevin froze. What met his eyes were eerie green indicator lights, thick bulletproof glass, and a dense network of metal tubes and wires wrapped around his body. This place looked like a cryogenic sleep pod. Before Kevin could figure out the situation, a flood of foreign and terrifying memories rushed in. A battlefield raining bullets, the aura of a superstar frantically idolized by the world. Deep in the jungle, the betrayed and twisted faces of his former team, Payback. In the endless torture under shadowless lamps, being shot, injected with unknown toxins, and repeatedly bombarded with radiation weapons. A few full minutes passed. Only then did Kevin's rapid breathing gradually stabilize. A flash of shock crossed his open eyes. He seemed to have transmigrated. And he had arrived in the bloody, violent world of the boys. Not only that, but the owner of this body was no nobody. He was the true original face of Vought International, the veteran superhero with near-invincible defense and terrifying destructive power, Soldier Boy, Benjamin. Fuck. Talk about a hellish start. Kevin inwardly drew a sharp breath. He strained to roll his eyes, taking in the dim laboratory outside the pod, which bore a heavy Soviet industrial style. So, what exactly was the timeline right now? If Kevin remembered correctly, in the original show's fucked-up plot, Soldier Boy had it rough. The legendary original American hero was repeatedly frozen a total of 3 times. The first time was during the operation in Nicaragua, where he was backstabbed by every member of Payback, the team he used to lead. Led by Black Noir, even his old flame, Crimson Countess, was involved. In the end, he was sold to the Soviets as a political bargaining chip, used as a lab rat in this godforsaken place, and tortured in a daze for nearly 40 years. And the mastermind behind all of this was definitely Stan Edgar, the perpetually suited, hypocritical, cold-blooded ruler of Vought International. The second time, after finally seeing the light of day again, he had originally agreed to help the boys deal with Homelander. Only to get completely derailed at the critical moment because he went to beat his goddamn grandson. Then he was left utterly bewildered by that cuckold butcher's line, "He's my wife's son," which triggered infighting and led to him suffering heavy blows from multiple sides. Once again treated as a dangerous, uncontrollable weapon, he was backstabbed by the boys and shut right back into a cryogenic sleep pod. As for the third time, which was the recently updated Season 5, Episode 7, leaving only the final episode before the grand finale. After handing over the V1 formula to Homelander, Benjamin had intended to completely cut ties with his past and leave for South America to enjoy himself. But because he said, "Good luck, son," to Homelander, it caused that man-child, starved for affection, to instantly break down. His emotions completely exploding, Homelander retaliated like a mad dog, locking his neck in a death grip until he choked out, ushering in his third freezing. Reviewing the tragic history of his new body, Kevin inwardly rolled his eyes. Soldier Boy, more like Popsicle Boy, huh? Frozen 3 times, backstabbed 3 times. What kind of original hero is this? This is a textbook definition of a pathetic, easily manipulated sucker. That cuckold was right, Soldier Boy is just a giant cunt. No matter where he goes, he gets backstabbed and betrayed. But, now that my consciousness has completely taken over this body, and I'm awake, feeling the terrifying power stirring deep within him like a nuclear reactor. Beneath the metal mask, Kevin's lips curled into a defiant smirk. If the cryogenic pod couldn't keep him contained, did that mean these freezing devices wouldn't be able to restrict him anymore? Before transmigrating, Kevin had never been one to waste energy on internal conflict. In his past life, he had no parents and no partner. Having arrived in this chaotic world full of soups, he might as well make the best of it. So what if he had to abandon his past identity as Kevin? From this day on, he was Benjamin. He would enjoy this perfect physical form at the peak of humanity, enjoy the absolute power brought by top-tier superpowers, and enjoy the endless pleasure of eternal youth. Since he was already here and there was no going back, he might as well live it up to the fullest in this world. As Benjamin fully accepted his new identity, a status panel suddenly lit up right in front of his field of vision. A notification chime rang in his ears. Ding! Host consciousness integration complete. The child education system is officially activated. Current identity: Soldier Boy Benjamin. Current abilities: Nuclear Energy Blast LV3 can release high-intensity radioactive energy capable of incinerating anything and burning away the compound V inside a target's body. Super Strength LV5 possesses the top-tier super strength of elite supes. Super Defense LV5 invulnerable, immune to conventional firearms and most sup attacks. Self-Healing LV5 extremely high cellular activity, capable of rapidly repairing fatal wounds. Radiation Resistance LV5 completely immune to nuclear radiation and all harmful rays. Eternal Youth physical form permanently remains at its peak. Benjamin raised an eyebrow and continued scanning down. System introduction: This system is bound to the host. Your mission is to educate your rebellious offspring, Homelander, John. Mission description: As the biological father of Homelander, it is your responsibility to guide this wayward offspring back onto the right path. Whenever you successfully alter Homelander's pathological mindset, correct his heinous behavior, reshape his warped worldview, and compel him to make righteous choices, or simply make him deeply feel the heavy love of a strict father, rewards will be triggered. Rewards include but are not limited to: all-around limitless enhancement of base physical attributes, gaining flight, gaining heat vision, increased mastery over nuclear energy blast, elevated self-healing capabilities, and various other abilities. Staring at the words on the light screen, the usually composed Benjamin fell into a rare, prolonged silence. A system, telling me to educate Homelander. In the world of the boys, most people's evaluations of Homelander were surprisingly unanimous: an extremely narcissistic manchild, a bloodthirsty, sadistic dictator. Countless people lived in terror of him. The boys even dreamed of tearing him limb from limb. But, truth be told, Benjamin didn't actually hate Homelander. Chapter 2: Breaking out of the lab. Or rather, from his current perspective as a transmigrator with an omniscient view of the plot. And now, having become the guy's nominal and biological father, Benjamin actually felt that Homelander's character was deeply tragic, even a little sympathetic. John had been stripped of his right to a normal family from the moment he was born. His childhood: no toys, no parental hugs, only the cold labs of Vought International. Only endless blood draws, electric shocks, and oven experiments designed to endure extreme heat. The scientists in white coats didn't view him as a human being at all. They merely saw him as their most perfect product, named Compound V. When he grew up, Vought slapped a hypocritical halo over his head, making him play the role of a glorious savior in front of the cameras. For the first half of the story, Homelander was even willing to risk his life for Vought, desperately trying to maintain the glory of the Seven. To tell the truth, if any ordinary person with Homelander's power had experienced Homelander's childhood, they would almost certainly grow up to be an antisocial terrorist 100 times more insane than he was. For Homelander to have even made it this far was already pretty good. Vought had personally turned Homelander into a twisted test subject starved for affection since childhood, and now they expected him to be a hero of the light. To use him to frantically rake in cash. What a joke. Since I'm your old man now, Benjamin thought to himself. Homelander, I'll personally make up for that childhood you missed out on. What father wouldn't want to personally raise his own son, and even pass the hero's mantle down to him? Benjamin quietly mused. Taking a deep breath, Benjamin snapped his attention back to reality. Feeling the bone-chilling cold around him, a violent red glint flashed through his eyes. First things first, getting the fuck out of this goddamn ice prison. As Benjamin focused his mind, a terrifying power that had slumbered for nearly 40 years began to awaken deep within his chest. A blinding light quickly lit up his chest, illuminating the dim cryogenic sleep pod with brilliant clarity. Outside the pod, the needles on various warning gauges instantly maxed out, letting out an ear-piercing buzz. Deep within the secret Soviet military base, an air raid siren suddenly blared. Urgent red lights flashed repeatedly across the laboratory. Soon, squad after squad of fully armed Russian soldiers, carrying automatic rifles, converged frantically on the core laboratory as if facing a formidable enemy. What the hell is happening? A commander holding the rank of major rushed into the control room drenched in sweat, grabbing the collar of a lab technician who was frantically typing on a keyboard. Sir, it's the cryogenic sector holding Soldier Boy. The technician pointed at the energy readings spiking wildly on the screen. "Goddamn soldier boy, he's actually awake. How is that possible?" The major slammed the technician aside and roared. "That extreme cold pod was built specifically for him. He's been sleeping in there like a corpse for 40 full years, how could he suddenly wake up without any warning?" However, the reality was right before their eyes. Outside the cryogenic sector, a massive force of Russian soldiers had already assembled behind layers of steel barricades. Dozens of AK rifles were all locked onto the pod, which was continuously radiating intense heat. Terror was written all over every soldier's face. The entity locked inside was no ordinary soup. That was the strongest original hero who could tear tanks apart with his bare hands half a century ago. A monster who could shrug off AK fire and remain completely unscathed. Inside the pod, the blinding red light grew more and more intense, like a miniature sun rapidly expanding. The soldiers quickly opened fire. Bang 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 bang. Dense muzzle flashes instantly illuminated the entire underground laboratory. But it was all too late. Boom! With a massive roar, a nuclear energy blast erupted outward, centering on the cryogenic pod. A blinding stream of high-energy red particles swept out. The indestructible pod instantly blew into pieces, sending tons of metal fragments exploding outward. The terrifying blast swept through everything in the lab like a hot knife through butter. The first to bear the brunt were naturally the Russian soldiers surrounding the front line. Before they could even let out a scream, they were annihilated by the nuclear energy. Soon, more Russian soldiers poured in from outside the lab. Through the thick smoke, a steady, heavy, and unhurried set of footsteps echoed. Thud, thud, the dust gradually cleared. A tall, naked man stepped casually out of the raging fire. Benjamin casually ripped off the deformed metal breathing mask over his face, tossing it to the ground like a crumpled cracker. He took a deep breath, taking in his surroundings. Monster. The Russian soldiers broke, squeezing their triggers one after another. Rat-tat-tat-tat-it. Dozens of rifle rounds poured out, accurately striking Benjamin's chest and face. However, a despair-inducing sight followed. The moment the bullets made contact with Benjamin's skin, they dropped feebly to the ground. Benjamin glanced down at the spent slugs on the floor, then looked back up, flashing a cruel smile. Less than greater than 5 minutes later, looking at the carnage, severed limbs, and broken bodies littering the floor, Benjamin shook the blood off his hands with a hint of disgust. He walked over to a relatively intact corpse, bent down, and stripped off a heavy, oversized green Russian military greatcoat, tossing it casually over his muscular frame. The wind and snow from outside the base poured through the blasted opening, making the greatcoat whip loudly. Benjamin took a deep drag of this air of freedom he hadn't tasted in 40 years. Based on his deductions, the boys hadn't arrived yet, which meant his current point in the timeline should be somewhere around Season 1 or Season 2. He just didn't know the exact moment. Had Huey's girlfriend been run over and killed by a train yet? If possible, he wanted to stop it. He would use that as a stepping stone to get in touch with Vought and reach Homelander. If possible, he might as well save Huey along the way. After all, he was a superhero, the strongest original superhero. Soldier Boy planned to do some good while giving A-Train a proper education, and use the opportunity to educate the entire Seven, including Homelander. If he could use this to purge, control, and restructure the corrupt Vought International, Benjamin was going to make Vought a real superhero company. Shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his greatcoat, he strode out of the base. Chapter 3. Bullying A-Train. New York City, USA. Benjamin stood on the rooftop of an old apartment building in Midtown Manhattan, clutching a recently activated smartphone as Vought International's latest stock prices scrolled across the screen. He shoved the phone into his jacket pocket, turned around, and headed downstairs. A week ago, he was still in an abandoned military base near the Russian border. Now, having ditched the Russian military greatcoat, he wore a brownish-green leather jacket scored from a thrift store. With his beard and hair trimmed, he walked along the sidewalk of 7th Avenue in Manhattan, turning heads at an absurd rate. To be honest, this face was undeniably handsome. After all, it had once been sat on by the Queen of England. Passing by a convenience store's glass window, Benjamin caught a glimpse of his reflection. He was heavily built with rugged features, his face carrying all the maturity and sharpness one would expect from a man in his early to mid-30s. The unkempt vagrant look was completely gone. In his current state, nobody would doubt it if he claimed to be a washed-up Hollywood action star. He stopped in his tracks, his gaze landing on a massive electronic billboard across the street. The billboard showcased promotional events featuring Translucent of the Seven. Benjamin stared at the billboard for 5 seconds, the corner of his mouth twitching upward slightly. Translucent was still alive. Now this was interesting. He kept walking, crossed 2 blocks, and sat down at an outdoor table of a cafe. Ordering a black coffee, he began to sort through the current timeline. An electronics store window on the street was broadcasting Vought News Network's midday program. The host was foaming at the mouth, hyping up a bank robbery foiled by soups. This was the very beginning of Season 1. Queen Maeve was still serving as the Seven's feminist poster girl, the Deep was still getting off to dolphins at the aquarium, and Homelander was putting on his usual righteous savior act. In Starlight, Annie January. That naive blonde girl hadn't officially joined the Seven yet. Which meant Huey Campbell's girlfriend, Robin, was most likely still alive. Benjamin finished his last sip of coffee, set the cup down, and used his phone's navigation to find an electronics retail store. The current Benjamin wasn't the old Benjamin anymore. He wasn't like that century-old fossil who knew absolutely nothing about modern gadgets. He had spent 3 days scouting the place. The shop's location and that tall, lanky clerk with glasses who always wore a mild smile, Huey, had been thoroughly mapped out by him. Benjamin had even gone into the store specifically to buy a phone charger, just to observe this future core member of the boys up close. Huey really was a good guy. The kind of good that made it hard to watch him go through any tragedy. Benjamin evaluated internally, less than greater than, 8 a.m. the following morning. Benjamin appeared right on time across the street from the Brooklyn Electronics store. In his hand, he carried a large metal bucket bought from a hardware store. Inside was a full 3 gallons of industrial-grade lubricant. Highly viscous with top-tier adhesion, it could form an oil slick on the asphalt slicker than ice. Finding a fire hydrant diagonally opposite the shop, he sat down and placed the bucket by his feet. Through the store's floor-to-ceiling glass windows, he could clearly see Huey attending to a female customer. Huey was wearing a navy blue work uniform, holding a latest model tablet, demonstrating some feature to the girl. His body language as he spoke was full of enthusiasm, occasionally pushing up the glasses on the bridge of his nose, his smile completely non-threatening. Watching this scene, Benjamin expressionlessly unscrewed the lid of the metal bucket. Right at the start of episode 1, he noted inwardly. Traveling from Russia back to the United States had taken him a full week. He didn't have super speed or flight. His speed was just like an ordinary person's. But that was precisely the part he was least worried about. Educating Homelander would have to be put on the agenda sooner or later. When the time came, there was a good chance he could acquire super speed and flight. By then, paired with his current abilities, he would have 0 weaknesses. The shop door opened. Huey and Robin walked out hand in hand, chatting. Huey laughed as he talked, while Robin poked his waist with her finger, teasing him for getting too carried away. They stood outside the shop for a moment, then slowly walked along the sidewalk. A yellow taxi was parked by the curb near the shop, an A-Train poster slapped on its roof advertising display. Benjamin picked up the metal bucket, stood up, and followed behind the pair. Soon, Huey and Robin stopped at an intersection. Robin stood right on the edge of the curb, half a step further back was the street buzzing with traffic. Huey stood in front of her, gesturing with his hands as he spoke, making Robin giggle. Benjamin stopped about 100 meters away from Robin. Bending down, he tilted the metal bucket, and the thick lubricant poured out of the spout, spreading across the roadside. He pulled a discarded long-handled brush he'd scavenged from beside a trash can out of his pocket and spread the oil film evenly, ensuring the coverage area was sufficient. This was a train's mandatory path. His speed was too fast, so fast that an ordinary person's naked eye could barely catch his trajectory. Robin's flesh and blood would explode into a mist of blood the instant he slammed into her. A train's speed meant trying to intercept him manually was unrealistic, as he could easily run circles around an old-timer. Benjamin could have used his own body to block him in advance, but he didn't need to do that. Nor did he intend to get hit by a train, just to avoid getting covered in blood. Besides, given his own physical durability, if a train rammed into him, the speedster would lose half his life even if he didn't die outright. If a train's body wasn't tough enough, he might even be the one turned into minced meat instead. Of course, if Robin still somehow ended up getting killed despite this, Benjamin wouldn't have much to say. He'd already done his best, hadn't he? A low-frequency rumble echoed from the end of the street. A train was coming, and then, his right foot stepped right onto the slick of oil. The next instant, a train's body flew like a derailed artillery shell, slamming heavily onto the asphalt before sliding nearly 20 meters and coming to a halt by the curb. Fuck. A train curled up on the ground. Clutching his right knee with both hands, the leg armor of his suit was shattered, with blood faintly seeping through the cracks. His face was smeared with lubricant and street grime, his expression contorted into a mask of pure agony as profanities continuously spewed from his mouth. He snapped his head up, his bloodshot eyes locking dead onto Benjamin, who was holding the oil bucket. Benjamin shrugged, casually tossing the empty metal bucket to the side of the road. Then, he took a few steps toward A train, looking down from above at this superhero of the seven. "Hey, you dumbfuck, in a rush to get to your own funeral," Benjamin called out. "If I hadn't tripped you up, you would have blasted right through that woman. Aren't you going to get the fuck up and thank me?" Startled by the massive crash, Huey and Robin spun around at the same time. Robin's face instantly turned deathly pale. She saw A train on the ground, saw the oil slick cutting across the lane, and tracing back from the remaining footprints on the oil, her gaze finally landed right on the curb beneath her feet. She instinctively took 2 steps back, nearly stumbling before Huey caught her. Huey's hands were shaking. He looked at A train on the ground, then at the oil slick, and then at where they had just been standing. If A train hadn't slipped, based on his trajectory, his next step would have slammed directly into Robin. With a train's speed and physical mass, Robin would have absolutely been obliterated. Just like that guy said. Huey held Robin tightly in his arms, utterly terrified. Benjamin glanced at him, pulled his phone out of his pocket, and snapped a photo of A train on the ground. "Bitch," A train spat out an insult. But he knew he was in the wrong. Aside from cursing at Benjamin, he didn't make any other moves, pushing himself up to leave. "The fuck did you say?" Benjamin turned his head, extended his fist, and brought it straight down onto A train's head. A sharp pain instantly exploded in A train's skull. This single punch left A train completely dazed, blood leaking from his nose. And he was a soup. A train was both shocked and furious. "This is a lesson for your stupidity." Benjamin swung his fist again, landing several heavy thuds right onto A train's skull, pounding the speedster back to the ground until he was on the verge of blacking out. While the A train of Season 5 would eventually find his redemption, the current A train was an absolute, unmitigated asshole. He deserved a beating. Chapter 4. Notifying Homelander. After a round of bullying, A train had been knocked unconscious twice, only to be beaten awake again by Benjamin. The speedster had now truly experienced exactly what Black Noir and the rest of Payback felt like. Benjamin originally intended to leave, but suddenly realized something. His cold eyes looked down from above at A train on the ground. As a transmigrator who knew the plot inside out, Benjamin was well aware of his current situation. He had just saved Robin, who originally would have been pulverized by A train, and had casually beaten the crap out of this junkie who was riding way too high on Compound V. But this was New York, Vought International's turf. The street corner cameras, and maybe even the satellites overhead, had likely already recorded everything. With Vought's intelligence network, especially the deep, unfathomable CEO, Stan Edgar, figuring out his identity as Soldier Boy was only a matter of time. It could cause quite a bit of trouble. For instance, Edgar might deploy a swarm of soups or orchestrate a plan to drug him, getting him frozen again before he could even make contact with Homelander. And Benjamin couldn't be absolutely certain whether he would actually wake up a second time if he got frozen again. While Billy Butcher might eventually break him out, Benjamin had zero desire to cross paths with that cuckold. Since there was no avoiding it, he might as well flip the table right now. As long as he let Homelander know right now about his status as his biological father, given Homelander's pathological craving for family and his extremely unstable mental state. Vought's top brass wouldn't dare act rashly. This was his best way to break the deadlock. Benjamin began rifling through A train's body. Completely ignoring A train's furious yet cowering gaze, he bent down and calmly pulled out a smartphone. Cough cough, who the fuck are you? Clutching his broken ribs, A train coughed up blood while wheezing out a harsh threat, trying to use Vought's brand to back him off. "You lay a finger on me, Vought won't let you get away with it. Homelander will tear you into minced meat. Shut up, you pussy who only runs through women." Benjamin shot him a freezing glare. "If you've got the balls, why don't you try running into me?" Benjamin's cold look was so intense that it instantly made A-Train feel as if he had been plunged into an ice cave, forcing him to swallow the rest of his thread right back down. A-Train didn't dare open his mouth, let alone try running into Benjamin. Given this older guy's sheer physical durability, any impact would only leave the speedster severely injured or dead instead. Benjamin casually swiped the phone screen. When facial recognition failed, he shoved the screen directly in front of A-Train's cold sweat-covered face. With a click, the phone unlocked. "Listen up, you pussy who runs through women." Benjamin squatted down, grabbing A-Train by the collar and lifting him halfway off the ground. "Now, find Homelander's number in your contacts and call it." A-Train's face contorted in agony, but under Benjamin's absolute, deathly stare, his finger trembled as he tapped the number on the screen, a number he usually wouldn't dare dial lightly. The call went through. Benjamin snatched the phone away and hit the speakerphone button. Ring, ring. After a few rings, a highly conceited and audibly displeased magnetic male voice echoed from the other end. "A-Train, this better be important. I'm currently cooperating with PR, shooting these fucking promo videos." Benjamin stood up straight. Facing the phone, he spoke in a steady, old-school tone. "John." The sound of breathing on the other end instantly hitched. In this world, next to nobody dared call Homelander by his real name, let alone in a condescending, elder-like tone. "I'm Benjamin, though you might be more familiar with my other name, Soldier Boy." The moment the words left his mouth, the surrounding air seemed to instantly solidify. On the edge of the street, Huey's brain went completely offline. Though he was just an ordinary guy, he had grown up reading superhero comic books. Soldier Boy, the legendary hero who sacrificed his life in the 80s to save a nuclear power plant. A-Train, lying on the ground, was completely dumbfounded. Enduring the agonizing pain, he forced his head up, staring dead at this massive, mountain-like man in a vintage green jacket. The old posters from the lower levels of Vought Tower began to perfectly overlap in his mind with the sharp-featured, cold, and rebellious face right in front of him. This face, much like the readers themselves, was absolutely perfect. Holy shit, he's Soldier Boy, the legendary original superhero. But Benjamin's next words truly detonated the real nuclear bomb. The fall of 1980, Benjamin's voice was completely calm, as if he were merely recounting a trivial piece of history. "I was called into Vought, to that old bastard Vogelbaum's lab. It was a top-secret genetic experiment." There was a dead silence on the line, with only the faint trace of breathing coming through. "Then, I beat off, into a cheap cup," Benjamin said. "That psycho Vogelbaum used that stuff to make a child. In the spring of 1981, that child was born. A boy. And that boy is you, John." Silence. A suffocating, absolute silence. On the top floor of Vought Tower on the other end of the line, Homelander stood directly in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. His pupils dilated violently, his brain going completely blank in an instant. Homelander instinctively didn't want to believe it, yet his sixth sense screamed that every single word was the absolute truth. Father, origins, test tube baby. Benjamin paid no attention to Homelander's near-collapsing emotional state. As for this cheap son of his, he had no intention of engaging in any heartwarming father-son bonding at the moment. His goal had already been achieved. In the show, that was exactly how Soldier Boy laid it out. And Homelander, naturally, believed it as a matter of course. Though in the show, Homelander went on to dig up hidden files after Soldier Boy told him. What annoyed Benjamin a bit was that the current timeline was still in Season 1. Homelander, who was still wrapped completely around Madeline's finger, didn't possess that kind of autonomy yet. But it didn't matter, planting the seed of doubt was more than enough. Besides, Benjamin wasn't about to sit around and wait until Season 3 for Homelander to take over the company. He completely ignored the ghost-like, horrified expressions on Huey and Robin's faces. He also ignored A-Train, who was lying on the ground looking utterly brain-dead, questioning his entire existence. Benjamin spoke coldly into the phone, "Pass my words along to Vought, and to that fucking Stan Edgar who thinks he can control everything. I'm back." Click. Benjamin hung up the phone, preparing to leave. "Soldier Boy," Huey called out, stopping him. Benjamin turned his head, sizing up the protagonist of The Boys. "What is it?" Thank you for saving Robin. Next time, stay the fuck away from the curb. There's more than just one soup with super speed." Chapter 5. Vought's reaction. Benjamin's tall silhouette completely blended into the crowds of the New York streets. Naturally, the surveillance cameras had also recorded this one-sided beatdown. Wail, wail, wail. Piercing sirens from police cars and ambulances echoed as several vehicles with flashing red and blue lights screeched to a halt at the scene. A crowd of onlookers had already gathered on the surrounding sidewalks, boldly craning their necks to see what was happening. In this world thoroughly brainwashed by Vought International and flooded with superhero culture, many people held a near fanatical, blind adoration for supes. Even if a few had just witnessed the truth, there were plenty of latecomers who didn't understand the context and only saw Benjamin brutally beating A-Train. Oh my god, is that A-Train? Jesus, he's bleeding so much. That guy in the green jacket must be a psycho. He actually dared to attack a superhero. He must be some supervillain hiding in the shadows. Quick, take pictures and tweet this, Vought will definitely hunt that thug down. Several young bystanders, oblivious to the truth, held up their phones to snap frantic photos of A-Train, who was twitching on a stretcher like a dead dog. Their chatter was filled with vicious condemnation of Benjamin and intense sympathy for A-Train. In their warped reality, superheroes were the eternal embodiments of justice, meaning anyone who hit a supe had to be an unmitigated villain. Shut up, you idiots don't know shit. An angry roar cut through the crowd. It was Huey. This was a kid who usually kept his head down, too timid to even ask his boss for a raise. But right now, his eyes were bloodshot as he stepped in front of the people taking photos like an infuriated lion. An attack, a supervillain, open your fucking eyes and look at the skid marks and the blood on the ground. Huey pointed at the exact spot where Robin had been standing, his voice trembling with lingering terror. If that man hadn't stepped in, A-Train would have already run my girlfriend over and turned her into a pile of minced meat. Robin clutched Huey's coat tightly, yelling. He didn't even slow down. He was charging like an out-of-control missile. That man saved my life. A-Train tried to kill me. Huey and Robin's raw, immediate accusations, combined with the glaring physical evidence on the street, instantly silenced the clueless onlookers. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Less than greater than. Meanwhile, Vought International Tower, Midtown Manhattan, Crisis Management Center. This was the operational brain of Vought, housing the largest and most sophisticated information monitoring network in the entire United States. Right now, a massive curved screen spanning an entire wall of the crisis room was flashing with blinding red alarms. In the center of the display, a short video stitched together from street surveillance and bystander footage played on a continuous loop. In the footage, a burly man used lubricant to trip A-Train, acting as if he had known exactly when the speedster would pass through the area. A dozen senior tech analysts in the department were currently panicking like ants on a hot skillet, the frantic clacking of their keyboards echoing through the room. The sharp clack of high heels hitting the polished marble floor rang out, instantly silencing the noisy room. Madeline Stillwell, senior vice president of Vought International who held absolute authority over the seven, walked in with an icy expression, holding a warm cup of coffee. Can anyone tell me why, 10 minutes ago, the fastest man alive suddenly slipped and got his face pulverized on a Brooklyn street? Madeline's voice wasn't loud, but it carried a chilling edge that made throats go dry. No one dared to answer. She walked up to the giant screen, her brow furrowing as she studied the man in the footage, whose face wasn't even fully visible. The longer she looked, the deeper the suspicion and dread grew in her eyes. Who is this man? Madeline demanded sharply. His physical durability is off the charts. He completely dismantled A-Train with his bare hands. He even predicted exactly which street A-Train would be running down. A senior technical director wearing black-rimmed glasses swallowed hard and stood up trembling, clutching a freshly printed cross-reference report. Ms. Stillwell, the preliminary results from facial recognition and skeletal feature scans are in, the director said, his voice shaking. The system indicates, this man appears to be Soldier Boy. What did you say? Madeline's hand froze midair, her coffee cup instantly halting. Based on a cross-reference with Vought's internal, top-secret database. The tech director wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, his voice sounding increasingly hopeless. Skeletal density, muscular profile, gait analysis, combined with facial mesh capture, the accuracy rate is 99%. Madeline's face, usually pristine and masked behind a flawless veneer of corporate elegance, twitched violently for a brief moment. Ridiculous, she snapped, slamming her coffee cup onto the desk. What kind of a sick joke is this? Could it be some hardcore fan playing dress-up? Or a shapeshifting soup? The former is impossible, ma'am. The director pulled up a high-definition, magnified freeze frame on the display, showing Benjamin's cold, rebellious face clearly. No matter how perfect the cosplayer transformation is, it's impossible to perfectly duplicate biological markers like interpupillary distance and dermal microexpression textures. More importantly, the director's voice carried a chilling trace of absolute disbelief. Compared to the photos in our database from 40 years ago, he hasn't aged a single day. The entire crisis room fell into a tomb-like silence. Shock washed over Madeline's features. Her eyes widened as she stared fixedly at the man on the screen, her breathing growing rapid, her chest heaving heavily. Impossible. This is absolutely impossible. Madeline screamed internally. As a member of Vought's core executive circle, she knew all too well the filthy history that had been scrubbed clean 40 years ago. That man, the original superhero leader who once embodied the American spirit and held absolute leverage within Vought International, hadn't he been handed over to the Soviets long ago? Back then, to prop up a brand new, entirely controllable generation of superheroes and clear the throne for a young Homelander growing up in a lab, the current CEO, Stan Edgar, had personally masterminded that betrayal. They had covertly turned payback, leveraging the team members who were regularly abused by Soldier Boy, and worked alongside Black Noir, who was at the peak of his combat prowess, to execute a lethal trap. They used Soldier Boy as a political bargaining chip and lab rat, secretly selling him off to the Soviet KGB, while fabricating a global lie claiming he had tragically sacrificed his life to prevent a nuclear meltdown. It had been nearly 40 years. Madeline assumed Soldier Boy was long gone, trapped forever deep inside some frozen, subterranean Siberian research facility, never to see the light of day again. Who could have imagined he had actually broken out of the Soviet cage alive? Not only that, but he had returned to the United States, right back to New York, using an overwhelming display of dominance to completely cripple a member of the Seven right under Vought's nose. It was a slap to the face, and it was a declaration of revenge. Listen to me. Madeline took a deep breath, her eyes cold. Contain every single piece of information coming out of Brooklyn immediately. Wipe the cloud data. Send out the highest level PR non-disclosure agreements to every single bystander who was at the scene today, including that goddamn couple. We need to notify Homelander immediately. Tell him to drop whatever the hell he's doing, gather the rest of the Seven, activate maximum authorization protocol, and bring Soldier Boy back to me. Dead or alive, Madeline spat out the words through gritted teeth. She had no idea that at this exact moment, several floors higher up in Vought Tower, right in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows, the Homelander she took such pride in had just hung up the phone with that very man, and was currently sitting on the edge of a complete emotional breakdown, his entire reality completely shattered. Chapter 6. I'm Homelander, and I can do whatever the fuck I want. In the conference room on the top floor of Vought Tower, Madeline sat at the head of the long table. Seated before her were the currently available members of the Seven: Homelander, Queen Maeve, the Deep, Translucent, and Black Noir. Madeline spun the tablet around and slid it across the long table. On the screen, the footage of Soldier Boy beating a train played on a loop. I want the Seven to bring Soldier Boy back to Vought Tower within 3 days. Dead or alive, though alive is preferable. From the other side of the table, Homelander replied, I'm not going. The other 4 all looked toward Homelander in unison. Queen Maeve's brow furrowed slightly. Silence hung in the conference room for 3 full seconds. Translucent, sitting adjacent, had just rushed back from a fan meet and greet at Times Square and uncomfortably shifted his posture in his chair. The Deep kept his head down, staring into the water cup on the table, lost in thought. Queen Maeve stood with her arms crossed, looking first at Homelander and then at the Soldier Boy on the screen. She was somewhat confused by Homelander's refusal. Could he actually be afraid? Thinking of this, Maeve felt it was a genuine possibility. This was Soldier Boy, after all. Homelander. Madeline froze for a moment. Homelander finally raised his eyes. Those eyes, a blue too intense to belong to a human, reflected the frozen frame on the screen, reflecting the face of Benjamin, of Soldier Boy. His expression held no anger, nor any of his usual emotions. I said I'm not going. Homelander stood up, planting his hands on the table as he leaned slightly forward. Madeline, I want access to Soldier Boy's entire file. Until I find out why he's still alive, and why he looks exactly like he did 40 years ago, before I uncover the truth, the Seven doesn't touch him. He attacked a train, in public, in front of a crowd. Our stock opened 3 points down today. Then let A-Train get his own payback. Homelander shrugged, his lips curling into an entirely heatless smile. Oh right, I forgot. He currently has a brace clamped onto his knee, crying like a 12-year-old girl down on the medical floor. Translucent parted his lips, seemingly wanting to say something, but a lethal glare from Homelander instantly forced the words back down his throat. He knew all too well what that expression meant. You don't chime in when Homelander is in a foul mood. Madeline slowly stood up, her high heels clacking sharply against the marble floor as she walked over to stand in front of Homelander. Listen, Homelander, putting aside the fact that he is highly likely an imposter pretending to be Soldier Boy, even if he is the real deal, he still severely injured A-Train. Like I said, let A-Train handle it himself. The rest of you, leave. Madeline dismissed the others, leaving only Homelander behind in the room. Once Queen Maeve and the rest had exited, Madeline reached out to stroke Homelander's face, intending to use her old method. However, Homelander wasn't as utterly captivated as he usually was. I'm going to look at the files. Wait for my word, and until I know the whole truth, you are not to move against him. With that, he turned and left. He didn't even waste a spare glance on Madeline, who was already preparing to undress. The conference room door slammed shut heavily the moment he crossed the threshold. Madeline stood in place, staring in the direction where Homelander had departed. Her right hand unconsciously clenched into a tight fist, her expression incredibly dark. This was one of the very few times Homelander had openly defied her. Less than greater than 43 floors beneath Vought Tower, the records management center. The lighting in the corridor was as stark white as an operating room. Every 3 meters stood an identity verification terminal, with a guard posted every 15 paces. All security personnel were equipped with standard-issue gear heavy enough to suppress a C-class soup. This was one of the highest security sectors in all of Vought International, second only to the core Compound V research and development labs. Homelander's boots struck the epoxy flooring of the corridor, each stride carrying a tightly restrained fury. He had already hit 3 separate departments: records management, historical archives, and the board secretariat. Every single time, the staff had responded to him with the exact same standard, corporate smile. I'm sorry, Mr. Homelander, you need Ms. Stillwell's written authorization to view files at this classification level. Or, I'm sorry, the data is currently undergoing digital migration, so it's temporarily unavailable for review. Or even more directly, this file does not exist. Does not exist. Homelander came to a halt in front of the final service window, planting his fist heavily on the counter. The surface of the counter, constructed from bulletproof glass, shattered into a web of spider cracks radiating outward from his fist. The clerk inside flinched violently backward in pure terror, his chair flipping over onto the floor with a loud crash. Soldier Boy, Homelander's voice bled through the heavily fractured glass, every single syllable sounding as if it were being ground through his teeth. A World War II hero, a core member of Payback, and one of the founding pillars of Vought. And you are telling me his file doesn't exist? Or is it because his file contains some dirty little secret you're all trying to hide? I'm Homelander, and I can do whatever the fuck I want. I want to look at Soldier Boy's file. Now, tell me. The young man sprawled on the floor used a trembling hand to adjust his glasses, his voice shaking so violently it was barely coherent. He knew that the next words out of his mouth might very well get him killed. MMR. Homelander, the records, the tracking system shows that all of Soldier Boy's files have been archived under maximum security. Access privileges require a joint authorization signed by at least 3 members of the board of directors. Chapter 7. Pounding Homelander. Homelander didn't even let him finish. His eyes flared red, and his heat vision blew the clerk's head clean off. The head popped instantly like a watermelon. Only after blowing the young man's head off did Homelander realize what he had just done. Suppressing the urge to slaughter everyone in sight, he took a deep breath, his eyes still glowing red, and turned around impatiently to walk out of the records center. He didn't understand. A superhero, clearly America's hero, clearly his own idol, yet they wouldn't even give him the chance to look into his files. The security guards lining both sides of the corridor took a collective step back, their eyes filled with terror. Not a single one of them dared to stand directly in his way. Nobody wanted to get killed. For a few grand a month, who the hell was going to risk their life? The moment the elevator doors slid shut, Homelander caught his reflection in the mirror-like finish of the metal doors, seeing his own face still splattered with the young man's blood. His expression was hideous. It wasn't anger. What was currently coiled heavily in his chest was something far more suffocating than anger. It was pure, suffocating frustration. That was a sensation that used to be completely foreign to him. From the day he first opened his eyes in the lab's incubation tank, that kind of frustration didn't exist in his vocabulary. He was Homelander. He was the most powerful being on the face of this planet. He got whatever he wanted, and no one could stop him from doing whatever he pleased. But today, he had been blocked a full 4 times. And the thing stopping him wasn't some superior soup. It was a wall built out of rules and regulations, non-disclosure agreements, and practiced, corporate smiles. It was invisible and intangible. Throwing a punch at it didn't even make a sound. The file does not exist. Classified. Requires joint authorization. These corporate phrases were like pebbles, striking with precision at the softest, most vulnerable spot in his heart. Soldier Boy, the man suspected to be his father. The veteran he had watched on a loop in old archival footage countless times as a child, the man carrying a shield and storming the beaches of Normandy in black and white film. The only existence he could ever call his own kind in terms of bloodline and raw power. The only one who shared his level of power. He had thought the man was dead. Everyone told him he was dead. Dead in some top-secret mission, his body unrecoverable, leaving nothing but an old military uniform buried beneath a headstone. Homelander had even visited that cemetery himself, standing there for a long time, unable to fully articulate the emotion coiling inside him, just a profound sense of melancholy. And now, this man was back alive, showing up alive and kicking in Brooklyn, carrying a bucket of industrial lubricant and slamming a train straight onto the medical floor, smiling exactly like he did in those vintage photographs. He had even told him that he was his biological son, even if it wasn't in the traditional sense. Yet here he was, not even permitted to cast a single glance at Soldier Boy's file. Worse, he was being ordered by Madeline to slaughter the man who was highly likely his own father. Homelander clenched his fists, fury and suffocating humiliation twisting together relentlessly inside his chest. The elevator continued its ascent, the floor numbers ticking up one by one. He closed his eyes, forcing the tidal wave of emotion that was threatening to rip through his chest right back down into the dark. He was going to look Benjamin in the eye, less than greater than. 1 p.m., the rooftop of an old apartment building in Brooklyn. Benjamin sat on a battered old folding chair he'd salvaged from downstairs, clutching a can of ice-cold beer, a convenience store sandwich resting by his feet. He was waiting for someone. If everything went according to plan, that person would come looking for him. Granted, there was also a chance a whole mob would show up to cause him trouble instead. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewed twice, and was just reaching for a second can of beer when he felt a sudden stir of wind behind his back. Benjamin didn't turn around. Swallowing the food in his mouth, he took a leisurely sip of beer and set the can down by his feet. "I was wondering how many times you were going to circle my building before finally coming up." His voice was as casual as a neighbor making small talk about the weather. 3 laps, Homelander. The silhouette behind him didn't budge. Then, a voice spoke up from behind. "They say you're Soldier Boy." Only then did Benjamin slowly turn around. Sunlight hit his face, and it hit Homelander's face. The two men stared at each other across the expanse of the rooftop, one sitting on a broken chair, the other hovering in midair, with what felt like an entire era separating them. Benjamin stood up, crushing the beer can slightly in his grip as his eyes settled on Homelander's young, unblemished face. High brow ridges, a perfectly straight nose, and a sharp, slightly upturned jawline. It was a face plastered on posters across America, printed onto T-shirts, and projected across the massive screens of Times Square. Benjamin's gaze flickered slightly. He could see the trace of hesitation and underlying unease in Homelander's expression. The most powerful soup on earth stood before him, looking like a high school kid who didn't know where to put his hands. Benjamin stepped forward slowly. He set the beer can on the floor and cracked the knuckles of his right hand. Then he reared back his fist and, putting his entire weight into it, smashed it squarely across Homelander's multi-million-dollar face. The force behind the impact was staggering. A heavy crack echoed across the rooftop. Homelander's body reeled backward, his feet tearing off the ground as he flew into the concrete guardrail on the opposite edge of the roof. The balustrade shattered completely, sending Homelander plummeting off the edge of the building. Benjamin tracked him, leaping straight down after him. Sprawled in a heap of shattered concrete on the ground below, Homelander clutched his left cheek, entirely stupefied. Because a sensation he had almost completely forgotten was radiating from his left cheek, pain. Raw, genuine pain. It instantly triggered memories of his childhood. Of those handlers in sterile lab coats using every imaginable method to break him. Of the incinerator hot enough to vaporize his very tears. Pulling his hand away from his face, he looked down at his palm. A streak of blood was slowly smearing across the creases of his hand. He was bleeding. Homelander stared at the blood on his skin, his pupils instantly blowing wide. When was the last time he had bled? He couldn't even remember anymore. Maybe a decade ago, or maybe back in the lab. His skin was supposed to be completely indestructible. His body was supposed to be entirely invulnerable. Lasers, missiles, even falling meteors had never managed to leave a single mark on him. He snapped his head up, glaring dead at Benjamin as the older man landed in front of him. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Benjamin stood his ground, casually shaking out his right hand. The blow had been incredibly heavy, even his own knuckles felt slightly numb, but his face remained entirely unbothered. Truth be told, Homelander's overall raw strength at this point in time still outmatched his own. But relying on his devastating chest blast and his intimate knowledge of Homelander's psychological weak spots, Benjamin hadn't hesitated to strike. Looking down from above at Homelander sprawled in the dirt, his gaze was bone-chilling. "I'm teaching my pathetic goddamn son a lesson." Homelander's expression instantly froze, his rising fury ground to a halt, replaced by a look of near-total bewilderment. He had never been disciplined by a father before. Benjamin didn't give him a second to process, pressing onward. "Stan Edgar and my old team packaged me up and sold me to the fucking Russians. They tortured me for 40 years. They used me to test the absolute limits of compound V tolerance. They shocked me with electricity, burned me with open flames, and used cryogenic gas to freeze my internal organs just to watch them regenerate cell by cell. They fired AK-47s straight down my throat, not to mention those goddamn radiation experiments. I went through 40 fucking years of that. You grew up in a lab, you, of all people, should know exactly what that feels like. 40 whole years. And then I finally crawled out of that goddamn hole," he continued, his voice dropping to a harsh chill. "I traveled halfway across the planet back to America, turned on the television, and guess what the fuck I saw?" He thrust a finger directly at the bright red star-spangled emblem on Homelander's chest. "I saw my son wearing a Vought uniform, flashing a perfect corporate smile for the cameras, acting as a glorified lapdog for Stan Edgar, the very bastard who sold his father out. I saw you running around with Black Noir, working missions shoulder to shoulder, patting him on the back at press conferences and calling him your great partner. Noir, the literal son of a bitch who personally led the rest of Payback to drug me into a coma. You tell me, do you deserve a fucking beating or not? You disappointing piece of shit." Homelander clutched his face, parting his lips to speak, but the words caught hard in his throat. He wanted to fire back, but the split skin on his face was still throbbing. More than that, he couldn't find a single counter-argument. Not a single word. When Homelander finally spoke, his voice carried a faint, pathetic trace of a victimized child. "I couldn't get into the files," he whimpered. "I went down to Vought Records. I went to the archives, I went to the board secretariat. They told me your file didn't exist. They practically told me to fuck off. They blocked me a full 4 times. Chapter 8. Getting the Results. Benjamin looked at him. He looked at the streaks of blood on that young face, at the bloodshot veins tracing through those blue eyes. He looked at this kid who had grown up in a lab from childhood, suffering the same horrific torture as he had. Perhaps there was at least a reason for his own torture. After all, the original owner of this body had brutally abused his teammates first, pushing Black Noir and the others to their limits until Stan Edgar coerced them into mutiny. But Homelander, what the fuck did he do wrong? From the time he was a child, Homelander had no choice but to endure that horrific agony. Though it wasn't as long, spanning only a single childhood, Benjamin felt that this pain weighed heavier than the 40 years he had endured. He fell silent for a moment, then reached up and yanked a few strands of hair from his own head. The roots still carried the follicles as he thrust the hair right in front of Homelander. "If you can't access the files, look somewhere else. Don't tell me America's top soup doesn't even know how to get a goddamn paternity test at a hospital." Homelander's gaze dropped to the strands of hair. He carefully gripped them in his palm, then pushed himself up off the shattered concrete. His suit was coated in cement dust and debris, and though the wound on his left cheek had stopped bleeding, the streak of blood still stained his face. "Once you find out the truth, don't do anything reckless," Benjamin said, patting him on the shoulder. The gesture wasn't heavy, but the moment his palm landed, Homelander's body stiffened slightly. "Show the report to Edgar. He'll know how to contact me. I'll get my revenge sooner or later, but not today." Homelander didn't say a word. He just clenched the hair even tighter, turned around, bent his knees slightly, and suddenly blasted straight into the air. A shockwave exploded as his silhouette shrank rapidly against the high New York sky, turning into a dull red speck before vanishing over the Manhattan skyline. Benjamin watched Homelander vanish. At the same time, the system's notification chime rang in his ears. Ding! You have made Homelander feel the heavy weight of a strict father's love. Although he isn't certain you are his father yet, he has never been beaten or disciplined by a biological parent before. Experiencing your discipline has actually given Homelander a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Reward acquired. Super Speed LV1. Current abilities. Nuclear Energy Blast LV3 can release high-intensity radioactive energy capable of incinerating anything and burning away the compound V inside a target's body. Super Strength LV5 possesses the top-tier super strength of elite supes. Super Defense LV5 invulnerable, immune to conventional firearms and most sup attacks. Self-Healing LV5 extremely high cellular activity, capable of rapidly repairing fatal wounds. Radiation Resistance LV5 completely immune to nuclear radiation and all harmful rays. Super Speed LV1 possesses the speed of a standard sup. Eternal Youth physical form permanently remains at its peak. To tell the truth, given Soldier Boy's physical conditioning, his speed shouldn't have been this slow according to standard physics. Yet, his actual speed performance had been exactly like an ordinary human's. Any regular person on a rental bike could run circles around him. Perhaps it was some kind of restriction, or perhaps a failsafe left behind by Vought. Regardless, that limitation was now broken. Benjamin possessed the speed of a normal sup. He would never be run around like a dog again. Less than greater than. Sometime after 3 p.m., the Genetics Testing Center at New York Presbyterian Hospital. A man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, dressed in a loose-fitting hoodie, walked into the first-floor lobby. His slow, deliberate pace stood in stark contrast to the hurried patients and medical staff around him. His cap was pulled low and his sunglasses masked most of his face, but if anyone were to recognize the face hidden beneath those shades, it would detonate American social media within 5 minutes. Homelander had lived for nearly 30 years, but he had never done anything like this. Pressing a button on the automated ticket dispenser in the waiting area, he sat on a plastic chair for 20 full minutes before saying to a visibly exhausted front desk nurse, "I'd like to request a paternity test." The tone was so polite that it sounded foreign even to his own ears. Without lifting her head, the nurse handed him a form and 2 collection tubes. The sampling process was brief. He placed Benjamin's strands of hair into one of the tubes, pulled a few hairs from his own head to put into the other, filled out the paperwork, paid the fee, and sat right back down on that plastic chair to wait. The fluorescent light tubes in the corridor hummed with a low buzz. A young mother holding a child sat on the bench opposite him, the kid busy using a crayon to draw a red flower on the waiting area wall. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the burnt odor of a coffee machine, making everything feel surreal in its sheer ordinariness. Homelander stared at the mother holding her child, his mind completely unreadable. He waited for 2 hours. Maybe longer. Then the nurse called his number. Not the name Homelander, but John, the identity on the fake ID he'd had someone forge. Accepting the manila envelope, he walked into the stairwell, pushed the door shut, and only after ensuring no one was around did he rip open the seal. The report wasn't long, 3 pages filled with dense medical jargon and data tables. Shifting his gaze past all the genetic loci analysis and technical descriptions he couldn't comprehend, his eyes landed directly on the conclusion section at the very bottom of the final page. 3 lines of text stood out in bold print. Test result. The probability of paternity between sample A and sample B, John, is greater than 99.9%. Conclusion. Sample A is the biological father of sample B. Testing facility. Genetics Testing Center, New York Presbyterian Hospital. Chapter 9. The Death of Black Noir. Homelander leaned against the wall of the stairwell, the hand holding the report dropping to his side. The wall was freezing, the chill seeping through the fabric of his hoodie into his skin, but he didn't feel it at all. His gaze was fixed on a tiny crack on the opposite wall, yet his eyes weren't focused. His X-ray vision pierced straight through the wall, through the hospital, and across all of New York. He had a father, but no one had ever told him. Soldier Boy was his father. The white-coated researchers in the lab hadn't, Madeline hadn't, and neither had Barbara or Edgar. In his worldview, the word, father, was something that belonged to other people, just like the perfect families in breakfast cereal commercials. It was an illusion written into a script, a greeting image posted on Twitter by Vought's PR department every Father's Day. Now, someone had suddenly told him that he was real. A father who would beat him, and who would discipline him. He flipped the report back to the first page and read it again. Then he read it once more. By the third time, his hands began to tremble. Not from excitement, it was from hate. He hated Edgar. He hated that goddamn bastard who sat behind the round table of the board of directors, always facing everyone with a mild smile. He hated Vought, hated this lab cage that had contained him in an incubation tank for as long as he could remember. He hated Black Noir, hated that silent shadow who never spoke. He had patted that man's shoulder countless times, called him partner countless times. Yet that man had known about his father from the very beginning, and had even been one of the bastards who framed his father. His hatred needed an outlet. Homelander shoved the report into his hoodie pocket, pushed open the stairwell door, and walked out of the hospital. The wound on his face throbbed faintly under the sunlight, the dried streak of blood still hanging on his left cheek, unwiped. Less than greater than. Evening, Vought Tower. Homelander stepped out of the elevator, the paternity test report clutched in his hand, the paper already crumpled and wrinkled. He walked along the corridor, constantly looking around, searching. Finally, Homelander found him. In the lounge at the end of the corridor, Black Noir was sitting on the sofa. He wore his signature black suit, the mask concealing his entire face. An untouched glass of water sat on the coffee table in front of him, and the screen of a nearby tablet was lit up, playing some black and white comedy from the silent film era. Black Noir was watching intently, or rather, he appeared to be watching. His posture was straight to the point of stiffness, his hands resting flat on his knees. Homelander came to a halt at the lounge entrance. He didn't speak, but merely stood there, scrutinizing the silent figure on the sofa with a gaze he had never used before. Black Noir noticed his presence and slowly turned his head, the eyeholes of his mask aligning with the doorway. The two stared at each other. Noir, Homelander spoke, his voice abnormally calm. Do you know my father? Black Noir's head tilted slightly. Then Black Noir shook his head. Homelander walked into the lounge, his steps unhurried. He unfurled the crumpled ball of paper in his hand and flung it hard into Black Noir's face. My father, Soldier Boy. The probability of paternity is greater than 99.99%. Sample A is the biological father of Sample B. As a member of my father's team, you didn't know. Black Noir's gaze fell upon the piece of paper. He stared at it for a long time. The only sound in the room was the exaggerated piano accompaniment from the silent film. A comedic actor stumbled on the screen, silently tumbling down a flight of stairs, glaringly ridiculous. Then Black Noir nodded, and then shook his head. He wanted to explain something, but he couldn't speak. You knew the whole time. Homelander's voice suddenly became very soft, so quiet it was almost like he was talking to himself. Every single time you stood next to me, every single time I patted your shoulder and called you my partner, you knew. And you were one of the bastards who framed my father. Black Noir didn't move, like a silent black mirror. He knew he was done for. Homelander stopped speaking. He extended his hand, the 5 fingers of his right hand pressed tightly together, aiming his fingertips right at Black Noir's chest. The instant his fingertips made contact with the black suit, the fabric was pierced through like paper. Then came the skin, then the muscle, as Homelander's fingers pushed inward, inch by inch. Black Noir's body shuddered slightly. From beginning to end, his gaze never left Homelander's face. Black Noir was dead, his hands slid off his knees, hanging down at his sides, his fingers curling slightly. The silent film kept playing. Various cartoon characters also began to appear in his eyes. Less than greater than. Homelander pulled his hand back. He glanced down at his hand, then turned and walked out of the lounge. He didn't leave so much as a spare glance for the shell gradually growing cold on the sofa. Chapter 10. Benjamin's Threat. Stan Edgar's office was located in the southeast corner of the absolute highest floor of Vought Tower. It was a disproportionately massive circular room, with floor-to-ceiling windows spanning 3 sides that overlooked the entirety of Manhattan. Right now, the New York nightscape spread out beneath his feet like an ocean of light, the glow from countless office buildings reflecting off the surface of the Hudson River, swaying gently with the ripples. Edgar sat behind a massive solid wood desk, holding a glass of whiskey, the ice cubes clinking faintly against the glass. The next instant, the entire door of the office was ripped clean off its frame. Edgar's hand holding the glass didn't shake. He didn't even stand up, merely lifting his eyelids slightly, looking at the blood-stained blonde man standing in the doorway with the same clinical calm he used to review financial reports, a fresh wound scoring the man's left cheek. Homelander. He called his name, his tone placid. Your hand is tracking blood onto my carpet. Homelander stood in the doorway, his chest heaving violently. Facing Edgar, he hesitated slightly. It was an inexplicable fear instilled in him since childhood. Blood dripped continuously from the fingers of Homelander's right hand, staining the carpet. Deep within the pupils of Homelander's eyes, 2 visible beams of light burned, a clear sign that his heat vision was on the verge of erupting. A faintly flickering, scorching red glow loomed on the edges of his irises, causing the temperature in the office to spike by a few degrees. Soldier boy, he ground out through his teeth. You sold him to the Russians. You locked him in a lab for 40 years, and then you fabricated a story for me about him dying on a mission. You made me stand before his headstone in silence, you made me bow to his old military uniform, and you made me say in an interview that Soldier Boy was a great hero. And you knew where he was the entire time. You knew the whole time that he was strapped to an operating table, being relentlessly tortured. You even knew he was my father, yet you went ahead and did it anyway. His voice rose steadily, the final words practically screamed out. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the office vibrated in tandem under the aftershocks of his shout, emitting a low, sustained hum, as if the entire building were trembling. Edgar set his whiskey glass down on the desk, leaning forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Homelander completely devoid of fear or panic. Yes, he said, and Homelander's pupils contracted violently. He took a step forward, his boots crunching down on the splintered fragments of the door scattered across the floor. Then, Homelander closed the distance toward Edgar. Less than 3 paces separated them. He would only need to twitch a finger, or shift his gaze, to kill Edgar. Kill Edgar. The thought flared in Homelander's mind. Kill this bastard sitting behind the desk, looking at him with an expression that said he didn't give a shit about anything. He could do it. In less time than it took to blink, there would be a headless corpse lying in this office. But his hand stopped, not just because of that deeply ingrained, lifelong fear, but also because another sentence was echoing in his head. Once you find out the truth, don't do anything reckless. Show the report to Edgar. He'll know how to contact me. Don't be reckless. That was the tone of a father speaking to his son. Perhaps Soldier Boy intended to get his revenge with his own hands. Homelander's breathing grew increasingly heavy. Edgar watched this play out, his expression unshifting. He even picked his whiskey glass back up and took a sip. However, his fingers paused imperceptibly on the rim of the glass. It seems he told you a great deal. Edgar's voice remained steady. So, what is it you want now? Everything is still negotiable, isn't it? Though Edgar himself had no idea how Soldier Boy had uncovered these matters. Could it have been through his former teammates? Homelander placed his blood-slicked hand on Edgar's desk, the movement stiff and rough. He looked up at Edgar, the murderous intent not yet fully faded from his glowing red eyes. Soldier Boy wants you to contact him, Homelander rasped. Having delivered the message, he turned and walked out of the office. Less than greater than. Early the next morning, Benjamin was brushing his teeth when his phone rang. The 6:30 a.m. sunlight streamed through the apartment window. No one had come to cause him trouble since yesterday evening. As for A-Train, Vought's PR was already working damage control, claiming the speedster was currently in hot pursuit of a suspect at the time of his accident. The screen lit up, an unsaved, unfamiliar string of digits dancing across it. Benjamin stared at the numbers for 2 seconds, spat out the foam in his mouth, and pressed answer. Soldier Boy, the voice on the other end was composed, bearing the smooth, practiced texture of a veteran corporate executive. This is Stan Edgar. Benjamin wedged the phone between his ear and shoulder, turning on the faucet to rinse his toothbrush. The water rushed loudly for a brief moment before he unhurriedly countered, I know who you are. We need to talk. Edgar's voice came through again. Talk about what? Talk about how I'm going to kill you. tear your corpse to pieces, and feed it to the dogs. Edgar's tone remained unchanged. The situation has shifted. You and I both know that once certain things are blown wide open, there's no turning back. Vought can handle one Homelander. But a spiteful Homelander working alongside his father, even Vought can't survive that. Benjamin leaned against the edge of the sink, wiping the corners of his mouth with a towel. He didn't speak, waiting for Edgar to show his hand. That's your fucking problem, isn't it? Benjamin sneered. That goddamn Vought Corporation of yours should have gone under a long time ago. But before that happens, both you and Homelander will be completely ruined, Edgar counterargued. Your dear son cares about his reputation. At least for now, Vought controls the media narrative across the entire United States. Are you threatening me? Benjamin snorted coldly. If Homelander and I end up branded as traitors because of Vought, or ruined by some public relations campaign, when that time comes, maybe I'll take my pussy son and tear through all of New York, make him a little less of a pussy. No, maybe he and I will just obliterate the entire United States, then rebuild it with whoever's left and make America great again. Oh, by the way, I don't give a shit if you're recording this. You need to understand, once the gloves come off, who stands to lose the most? Homelander and I will just find somewhere else to live, but your Vought, and America itself, will cease to exist. Benjamin's tone was laced with venomous fury. Of course, Benjamin, calm down, which is why my suggestion is that we talk face to face, Edgar said. Not as enemies, but as two adults who need to resolve the exact same issue. You pick the location, you pick the time. We can certainly negotiate an outcome, can't we? Draping the towel over his shoulder, Benjamin looked at his reflection in the mirror, at this face that had once been sat on by the Queen of England, the corner of his mouth curving upward slightly. Then this afternoon, he said, at the cafe downstairs from my apartment. Come alone, if you aren't worried about me taking you out. He hung up the phone, tossed it back onto the edge of the sink, and resumed brushing his teeth. Chapter 11, Negotiating with Edgar. 2 p.m., the Streetside Cafe in Brooklyn. Edgar arrived even more punctually than he had anticipated. The man who controlled the world's largest superhero commercial empire pushed open the cafe's glass door, wearing a dark gray turtleneck sweater and black trousers. He came without any entourage or security, looking as low-key as a university professor on a business trip to New York. If Benjamin hadn't known exactly who he was, the man could have completely vanished into any crowd on the street. Edgar sat down across from Benjamin, ordered a black coffee from the waiter, then crossed his hands on the table and looked at the man opposite him. Benjamin leaned back against his chair, clutching an Americano that had already gone mostly cold, his posture casual, as if catching up with an old friend. Your son killed Black Noir last night, Edgar got straight to the point. With his bare hands, in the lounge on the 37th floor of Vought Tower. The security footage caught it clearly, I've already had it deleted. Benjamin took a sip of his coffee, his expression unshifting. He had already guessed it. The look Homelander had left with, the hatred burning in those eyes, needed an outlet. And his original body itself held a deep grudge against Black Noir. Besides Noir, there were several other members of Payback. Although he didn't personally hold a grudge, having inherited the original owner's body, avenging him wasn't crossing the line. Besides, those memories were genuinely real in his mind. Soldier Boy had never bullied a normal person. But in this world of the boys, full of psychos and freaks, normal people were far too rare. That was exactly why Soldier Boy used to bully people so frequently. Of course, bullying was plain wrong. But 40 years of torture was far more detestable than any justified bullying. So, you're here to pin that on me. I'm here to do business. Edgar's tone was as steady as if he were reading a financial statement. The current situation is quite simple. The combined strength of you and John, Homelander, the two of you together as father and son, is enough to completely erase Vought International from the New York Stock Exchange Board. I am not exaggerating, you know what I say is a fact. But by the same token, we at Vought also have capabilities, well, you understand. However, I am not looking to take the gloves off, because doing so offers absolutely no benefit to us, nor to you. He paused as his coffee was served. He picked up the cup, took a sip, and continued. But I believe we have a better way to resolve this. We do not intend to go to war with you, nor do we intend to go to war with John. Quite the contrary, I want you to return to Vought. Benjamin set his cup down, his gaze truly focusing on Edgar's face for the first time. Want me to come back? Benjamin sneered. Did you forget exactly who sold me to those fucking Russians? That was a mistake, Edgar spoke quickly, with almost no pause, as if he had rehearsed this exact sentence repeatedly at some negotiation table. A terrible decision made by the previous management. Of course, I am not here to defend it, I am here to propose a new solution. If I hadn't watched the original show, I might actually believe him, Benjamin sneered inwardly. Edgar pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, flattened it on the table, and slid it in front of Benjamin. It wasn't a formal contract, but a handwritten outline of terms. The handwriting was neat and well structured, clearly written by Edgar's own hand, or at least personally drafted by him. Return to Vought, and enter management as a soup, Edgar began to state, tapping his finger on the paper. Not to join the Seven, but to manage the Seven. Positionally, a brand new title will be established, the Executive Director of Superhuman Affairs, heading the Department of Superhuman Affairs. Your authority will rank higher than any member of the Seven, including Homelander. All mission assignments, personnel deployments, and operational approvals will strictly require your signature. On the decision-making hierarchy of Superhuman Affairs, your rank will be second only to the Board of Directors. He looked up, his gaze locking directly onto Benjamin. In other words, the position I am offering you is above your son. The cafe suddenly grew very quiet. An old radio in the corner was playing a jazz tune. Benjamin, of course, knew exactly what kind of game Edgar was playing. This old fox never made a losing deal. Giving him a seemingly lofty position was actually placing him and Homelander on opposite sides of a scale. He would keep Homelander in check, and Homelander would keep him in check, the two balancing each other out, while Edgar sat dead center on the scale, continuing to act as the puppet master. This was the art of power, the very game that people like Edgar excelled at. But Benjamin didn't call him out on it, because he had his own calculations as well. How about you step the fuck down right now, let me take your seat, and make me the boss of Vought? If the opportunity arises, perhaps you might achieve that. Edgar didn't refuse, he simply stated a possibility that could manifest in the future. Looking at Edgar, Benjamin felt a slight stir of interest. He was a transmigrator, after all. If he wanted to get close to Homelander, aside from taking him away by brute force, joining Vought was the best alternative. Furthermore, Benjamin wasn't the original soldier boy. His tastes were perfectly normal. To say he didn't want to get with Queen Maeve, Starlight, or Victoria Newman. Well, that was an absolute lie. He didn't know if Starlight had been blackmailed into degrading herself by the Deep yet, but it was probably coming soon. Whether it was dealing with Homelander or enjoying life, Benjamin needed Vought's resources. Moreover, if he wanted to eventually control the White House and dominate the entire United States just like in Season 5, joining Vought was a mandatory step. And then, find an opportunity for revenge later down the line. Executive Director, Benjamin said. Add one condition. Edgar raised an eyebrow. What I intend to build is a normal superhero company, not a talent agency for actors. Recall all the Compound V leaking out there, and ensure it never leaks again. I know my goddamn pussy son is the one distributing it, but all of this is happening with your blessing. Edgar's fingers paused on the rim of his coffee cup. This directly threatened Vought's core interests. But he only deliberated for less than 3 seconds. Deal. Benjamin picked up the completely cold coffee, downed it in a single gulp, and slammed the cup heavily back onto the table. Then I start work tomorrow. If you break the fucking rules, or if I find an opening, I will blow your goddamn head off and shove it up your ass. Edgar remained entirely expressionless. Chapter 12. The Return That Shook America. The news was leaked by Vought's PR department. A single photograph. No caption, no press release, no press conference announcement. Just a lone photo posted on Vought International's official Twitter account. The resolution was low. It was clearly a screenshot pulled from some surveillance footage. In the frame, a man wearing a brownish-green jacket stood on the rooftop of a Brooklyn apartment building, with the grayish-blue early-morning New York sky behind him. His face was only visible in a 3/4 profile, but it was more than enough. That sharp jawline, those broad shoulders, that posture with one hand slouched casually in his pocket, it was identical to the footage in the black and white documentaries looping at the Vought History Museum. The photo went up at exactly 7 a.m. By 8 a.m., Twitter's servers crashed. Over 8 million quote-retweets flooded the servers within a single hour. Led by TikTok, every platform amplified the exact same phrase at an exponential rate: Soldier Boy is back. The NASDAQ billboard in New York's Times Square made an emergency content switch. They swapped out the daily stock market ticker for a vintage photograph of Soldier Boy provided by the Vought Museum, 1944, the beaches of Normandy. He was carrying his iconic diamond-shaped shield with the bald eagle emblazoned on it, behind him burning landing crafts in a sky choked with anti-aircraft fire. Beneath the black and white photo, a line of gilded text scrolled by, "The legend returns. Soldier Boy confirmed to return to Vought International." The crowd gathering in the square grew larger and larger. People held up their phones to snap photos of the massive screen. Some dialed their parents on video calls, weeping directly into their screens. Others had rushed straight out of their hotel rooms still wearing pajamas. A veteran in his 60s, wearing a faded old dress uniform with a few tarnished medals pinned to his chest, stood directly beneath the giant display. He looked up at the black and white photograph, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks, his lips trembling as he muttered over and over again, "I saw him when I was a kid. I saw him in a parade when I was a little kid." CNN cut away from its regular morning programming. An MSNBC anchor, her eyes rimmed with red, told the camera, "The significance of this for America is beyond words." The commentators on Fox News reached a rare unanimous consensus. They ran the headline, "The Greatest Return of the Century," in a font size so massive it nearly consumed the entire screen. Yet the focal point of this entire frenzy was currently walking the streets. He was looking for someone. The Upper East Side of New York, a well-maintained but unpretentious old apartment building. The doorman, an Italian man in his 60s, took one look at Benjamin and stepped aside without asking a single question. The legend opened the door. The legend, the former senior vice president of Vought International, the man who once controlled the entire Department of Superhuman Affairs. Now, this former myth lived in an apartment crammed with vintage posters, old film reels, and expired magazines. He was wearing a pilled bathrobe, holding a martini glass. It was 2 p.m. He looked far older than Benjamin remembered. "Jesus," the legend stared at Benjamin standing at the door, his martini glass shaking slightly, nearly spilling the liquor. "What they're saying on Twitter is real. You haven't quit Twitter." "I did, then I made a burner." The legend stepped aside from the doorway. "Come inside. You're America's original hero, don't let anyone spot you." The inside of the apartment looked much larger than it did from the hallway. The walls were covered in movie posters, some originals, some autographed, some rare out-of-print pieces that even the Vought Museum probably didn't have archived. Benjamin stood in the center of the living room, his gaze sweeping over the posters. His own face stared back at him from several different frames. Wartime propaganda from the 40s, recruitment ads from the 50s, and a crudely drawn comic book cover. "You haven't changed a bit from those posters." The legend shut the door and leaned against the frame, sizing Benjamin up from head to toe. Benjamin turned around. "You kept my stuff, right?" The legend fell silent for 2 seconds. "How did you know I kept it?" "Because you're the legend," Benjamin said. "There's no way you threw my suit away." The legend took a sip of his martini and said nothing. He walked into the bedroom, returning a moment later with a garment bag in his hand. He laid it on the sofa. Inside were the following: a suit, predominantly deep green, featuring the white star emblem on the chest, and scratches of varying depths scoring the shoulder armor. The fabric felt a bit stiff to the touch, but the overall preservation was near flawless, down to the polished metal buckles on the gauntlets. Then there was the shield. However, only Soldier Boy could carry it, the legend couldn't lift it. Engraved with a bald eagle spreading its wings, it was Soldier Boy's weapon. The edges were slightly worn, but not a single rivet was missing. He walked over to where the shield was stored. Benjamin reached out, gripping the inner leather straps, and lifted the shield. Slipping his arm through the straps, he gave his wrist a quick spin. The shield cut through the air with a low, rushing hum. Watching this, a complex expression crossed the legend's face. "You killed Black Noir last night," he said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a question. "My son killed him. What's the difference?" The legend picked his martini glass back up and sat down on the sofa. "Stan Edgar called me this morning. Guess what he said?" "Spit it out." "He said you're starting work at Vought tomorrow. Executive Director of the Department of Superhuman Affairs. Authority ranking higher than Homelander." The legend cast a scrutinizing look over the rim of his reading glasses. "Vought tortured your son and packaged you up for the Ruskies, and you're still planning on sitting down to have dinner with them?" "I don't have that much of an appetite." Benjamin leaned the shield against the armrest of the sofa and began to strip off his clothes. Jesus, the legend stared at his physique, pausing. They used you as a lab rat. Yeah, a lab rat for 40 years. Benjamin put on the undersuit, his movements unhurried. But that's beside the point. I have something to ask you. Where's Crimson Countess? The legend's fingers froze on the rim of his martini glass. You didn't come back to catch up. You came back to settle scores. It's both. Benjamin fastened his breastplate, then began buckling the gauntlets. Give me the address. She'll run. She won't get far. Even if she does run, with Vought in play, how long can she hide? The legend fell silent. Then he set his glass down, picked up a pen from the coffee table, and jotted down a few lines on the blank margin of an old magazine page. Vought isn't entirely made of bad people, the legend said slowly as he handed him the scrap of paper. Benjamin took the paper, folded it, and slid it into the inner pocket of his suit. Understanding the legend's meaning, he countered, I know. You aren't a bad guy. Maybe my pussy son isn't either. Neither are the working class, the low-level staff, and some of the normal soups. That's why, I'm going to rebuild a brand new Vought rather than completely obliterating it. You need to remember, I'm a superhero. I'm not the bad guy. Strapping the shield onto his left arm, he walked toward the apartment door. Halfway there, he halted, turning his head back toward the old man on the sofa. Where are the guns? What guns? My guns. There's no way you only kept the clothes. The legend stared at him for 2 seconds, then walked over to a corner piled high with cardboard boxes and rooted around for a bit. First, he pulled out an M1911 pistol, followed by the iconic eaglehead knife, and a few other weapons. He laid these items out one by one on the coffee table. I loaded the ammo myself. It still fires, he said. You owe me $400. For the ammunition. Benjamin slid the knife into the hidden sheath on the side of his combat boot, tucked the M1911 into the holster at the back of his belt, and slung the Thompson strap over his shoulder. I feel like you're a bit different, Ben. The legend stared at Benjamin, his eyes flickering slightly. 40 years, Benjamin straightened up. A lot of things change. Yeah, the legend muttered to himself. A lot of things change. He just hadn't expected Benjamin to care so much about this son he barely knew. Less than greater than. Sunlight streamed at an angle through the dust-coated window at the end of the apartment corridor, hitting Benjamin's back. The deep green shoulder armor of his suit reflected the daylight, casting a barely perceptible, matte sheen. Pushing open the apartment building's main door with his free left hand, the early autumn New York wind rushed over him. Vought Tower was waiting for him over in Manhattan, where the superheroes in the conference room were about to accept a set of rules they had never seen before. Out in the far suburbs of Pennsylvania, there was also a woman who owed the original owner of his body a debt spanning nearly half a century. But right now, he was heading to Vought to see his son. As for Crimson Countess, no rush. He'd already waited 40 years. A day or two wouldn't make a difference. Less than greater than. The 42nd floor of Vought Tower, the Seven's main conference room. Inside, the remaining members of the Seven had arrived, while Ashley stood off to the side by the wall, auditing the meeting. A-Train sat in a wheelchair. Though his knee was mostly healed, he insisted on using the wheelchair under the pretext that it makes me look more like the victim. An exaggerated stabilizing brace was still clamped onto his right leg. Because of his near-fatal incident yesterday, A-Train had been entirely consumed by PR damage control over the last 2 days, keeping him incredibly busy. However, this look also garnered plenty of sympathy from certain fans. After all, supposedly he had only ended up like this by accident while hot on the heels of a fleeing suspect. Translucent sat at the far end of the long table, fully visible, looking rather tense. The Deep sat next to him, a glass of water resting in front of him as usual, his expression even more bewildered than ordinary. He had already heard about Black Noir, but didn't know the details. He only knew that Noir's lounge had been permanently locked down since last night, and nobody had told him why. Did Noir go to Orlando? The Deep wasn't exactly a genius, so he couldn't figure it out. Queen Maeve stood by the window, her arms crossed as she leaned against the floor-to-ceiling frame. Only one person was capable of killing Black Noir. Maeve thought to herself, what the hell is that psycho planning now? Granted, there was one other person, but that man hadn't even been at the company yesterday. The conference room doors opened. Homelander walked in, his cape kicking up a small slipstream behind him. Sporting a faint smile, he walked over to the head of the long table, but instead of sitting down, he stood to the right of the main seat, placing his hand on the back of the chair. Everyone, Homelander's voice was clear, carrying far less of his usual press conference theatricality and a layer of solemnity. Before we begin today's agenda, I want to introduce someone to you. He turned toward the conference room doors, extending his hand. Every single gaze shifted to the doors at the exact same moment. They all knew exactly who was coming. Chapter 13, Straightening Out the Seven's Discipline. The door opened, and then they saw the shield. The diamond-shaped shield engraved with the bald eagle entered their field of vision first through the crack of the door. Then came the deep green suit. Finally, that face that had once been sat on by the Queen of England. A-Train and Translucent froze. The Deep just stood there with his mouth open, knocking over the glass in front of him. Water trickled down the tabletop, dripping one drop at a time onto the carpet. Seeing this, Homelander cast a somewhat disgusted look at the Deep. Maeve pushed herself away from the window frame and slowly straightened up. A trace of awe appeared in her usually sharp eyes. Benjamin walked into the conference room, the shield strapped to his left arm, his combat boots stepping on the carpet without making a single unnecessary sound. He came to a halt at the far end of the long table, his gaze sweeping across every face in attendance, as if inspecting a squad of raw recruits. "Soldier boy," Homelander continued, his voice laced with an emotion he couldn't entirely control himself. "My father. And also, my predecessor. Starting today, Soldier Boy will serve as the executive director of the Department of Superhuman Affairs for Vought International. All mission assignments, personnel deployments, and operational approvals for the Seven will be entirely under his signature. His authority ranks above mine." The others hadn't known about this. They had thought Soldier Boy was simply joining the Seven, never expecting. Every soup present digested the meaning of those words at the exact same moment, each displaying varying degrees of surprise on their faces. A-Train's expression shifted from shock to disbelief, Translucent's expression froze, and the Deep finally snapped out of it, wiping the water off the table while resuming his usual brain-dead look. Meanwhile, Maeve glanced at Homelander, then back at Soldier Boy. After saying this, Homelander's gaze swept across every face at the long table. His expression management was practically flawless, the corners of his mouth curving slightly upward with joy and pride. But if anyone looked closely enough, Homelander really was happy. After all, the person standing at the other end of the table was the real deal, his own bloodline, his father. But at the same time, when Homelander uttered the words, "Authority ranks above mine," he felt a bit uncomfortable and conflicted inside. Soldier Boy had a higher position and greater power than him, even though their raw strength was pretty much matched. From this day forward, Homelander was no longer the unassailable pinnacle of Vought's superhuman hierarchy. Naturally, he was quite frustrated. But that man was Soldier Boy, his father. So, Homelander merely bit his lip and didn't show much dissatisfaction. Benjamin placed the shield on the long table, the bald eagle paint facing upward, reflecting a quiet sheen under the conference room lights. Planting both hands on the edge of the table, he leaned forward slightly, addressing the group of the world's most powerful soups with his first words of the afternoon. "I'm Soldier Boy, nice to meet you all." His tone was flat. "But pleasantries aside, starting today, the rules of the Seven are going to change." Benjamin's gaze slowly swept from the left side of the long table to the right, as if taking inventory of a pile of defective stock. Then his eyes settled on A-Train. A-Train sat in his wheelchair. With his elbows resting on the armrests and his chin slightly raised, he tried to project the aura of a superhero who had been wrong but remained defiantly unyielding. But the instant he was locked under Benjamin's gaze, his back involuntarily pressed hard against the backrest of the wheelchair. "A-Train," Benjamin said. "You pussy who only runs through women. Slap yourself twice. If you don't do it, I will." Hearing this, A-Train's pupils contracted violently. Hadn't he already been beaten? And beaten half to death at that? His gaze instinctively drifted over to Benjamin's side. Homelander was already standing right next to Benjamin, looking completely obedient. His cape draped behind his back, his arms crossed over his chest, his blue eyes staring dead at him without blinking. Entirely expressionless. But it was precisely this lack of expression that made his skin crawl more than any explicit threat. The meaning was crystal clear. "My dad told you to do it. You'd better do it yourself." A-Train's Adam's apple bobbed. Smack, smack. Two sharp cracks echoed as A-Train's palms slammed squarely against his left and right cheeks, the force so heavy that he even stunned himself. Two deep red handprints rapidly surfaced on his face, a trace of blood even leaking from the right corner of his mouth. Benjamin watched expressionlessly before continuing, good. And A-Train, if I ever catch you doping yourself up for your upcoming races again, you're off the goddamn 7. Something buzzed loudly inside A-Train's brain. Doping. Compound V. He had kept this incredibly well hidden, nobody should have known. Even if Homelander had him distributing Compound V, Homelander shouldn't have known he was using it himself. No, maybe he did know, otherwise, how would Soldier Boy know? He snapped his head up to look at Benjamin. But Benjamin's expression bore absolutely no trace of interrogation or probing. His demeanor while saying this was exactly the same as when he ordered him to slap himself. Flat, certain, as if stating an open fact. Then his gaze involuntarily drifted back to Homelander. Homelander must have told Soldier Boy. And Homelander just stood there beside his father, staring at him with a pair of entirely heatless eyes. Swallowing hard, a drop of blood from the corner of A-Train's mouth dipped down his chin. He didn't wipe it. Yes, sir. Benjamin's gaze shifted away from him, settling on another figure at the long table. Translucent. Translucent's body stiffened slightly. Honestly, he had been secretly rejoicing inside just moments ago. A-Train had been singled out, and the Deep likely wouldn't escape either, but aside from his fondness for hanging out in the ladies' room, he didn't really have any vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He was supposed to be one of the better soups. But Benjamin's next words made his sphincter instantly tighten up. Translucent, if I ever catch your disgusting ass naked in a bathroom peeping again, I'll shove a bomb straight up your ass, blow you sky high, and feed your minced meat to the fucking dogs. Translucent froze completely in his chair. While the exterior of his carbon metamaterial skin was indestructible, his insides were vulnerable, even if his exterior was indestructible. And that weakness was something he had never told a soul. An image involuntarily flashed in his mind. The imagery was so specific and vivid that he had to squeeze his eyes shut. Is this the wisdom of the original superhero? An old fossil who just crawled out of a Russian lab after being frozen for 40 years. He'd only been back for a few days, yet he already had a total lock on the one fatal vulnerability nobody else had uncovered in his over 10 years at Vought. Translucent parted his lips to speak, but ultimately just mumbled submissively, yes, sir. It will never happen again. Standing at Benjamin's side, Homelander blinked. The light in his blue eyes flickered slightly. A-Train nearly running someone over, Translucent peeping, he knew about all of it. There was nothing inside Vought that stayed hidden from him. But in his eyes, these were just harmless little flaws. What was the big deal about running someone over? What was the big deal about taking a little peek? It wasn't exactly a massive crisis. Homelander had actually expected Soldier Boy to go after the even more pathetic Deep first. After all, that useless piece of shit could only talk to fish. He didn't quite understand why his father was making an example out of such trivial, petty bullshit. Was this enforcing discipline, establishing dominance, or was it? Suddenly, a few images flashed through his mind. His expression froze slightly. It seems, the bad shit I've done is way worse. Maeve. Queen Maeve looked toward Soldier Boy. Even before Benjamin stepped into this conference room, she had harbored complicated feelings about the return of Soldier Boy. But as Benjamin handled A-Train and Translucent one by one, she couldn't help but see him in a different light. Even if his true motive was just asserting dominance rather than genuine disciplinary reform. Hearing her name called now, her spine unconsciously straightened a bit. If Translucent is it again, report it to me. Yes, sir. Maeve's gaze swept over to Translucent, the contempt in her eyes entirely undisguised. She had worked with Translucent for a long time, and any shred of goodwill she ever had for this teammate had long been eroded away by his shady little habits. Now that someone was keeping him in check, and doing it by aiming straight for his throat, she actually felt a long overdue sense of satisfaction. Caught between both of their gazes, Translucent ducked his head, repeating, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Never again. The Deep. Benjamin's voice turned to his next target. The Deep's shoulders visibly flinched. The glass of water in front of him had already been knocked over once, and after a clumsy scramble to set it right, it had left an unwiped puddle on the tabletop. He looked up at Benjamin, doing his best to make his expression look composed, but the sheer panic bleeding through his eyes betrayed every single internal thought. A-Train had been publicly slapped, Translucent had been threatened with an bombing, and now it was his turn. He had no idea what was waiting for him. I haven't really done anything bad, right? Probably not. Benjamin looked at him, the disdain in his gaze needing no words to articulate. A useless piece of shit who likes to fuck fish. The conference room fell into a dead silence for 2 full seconds. Ashley didn't even dare to breathe. She couldn't believe that the very first thing Soldier Boy did after returning was to discipline, or rather, educate, the entire 7. Chapter 14. Homelander is a child. Hearing Soldier Boy insult the Deep, the corner of Homelander's mouth twitched visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing as he barely held it together. The Deep's face flushed the color of pork liver. He wanted to say something, wanted to defend himself, to argue, to say that those dolphins were willing participants. But the Deep glanced at Homelander, then at Benjamin's disgusted face, and ultimately chose to keep his mouth shut. Benjamin didn't waste any time on him, he was just a useless piece of shit who liked fucking fish. Starlight hadn't arrived yet. If the events of the original show really went down when the time came, he would just find an opportunity to bully and discipline him again. Soldier Boy shifted his gaze to the last person who needed to be called out individually. Maeve. Maeve froze slightly. She had already been called out once regarding the matter with Translucent. You need to be a real superhero. The tone of this statement was completely different from all the previous reprimands. To be honest, aside from being a lesbian, Maeve didn't really seem to have any other notable flaws. And being a lesbian was nothing, certainly better than fucking fish. Compared to the others, she was still relatively normal. Maeve didn't speak, her lips moved slightly, and she nodded heavily. Soldier Boy really seems different from the rest of my teammates, Maeve thought to herself as she looked at Benjamin's perfect, charismatic face. I will, sir, Maeve said. Benjamin withdrew his gaze, looking at Homelander, who was enjoying the drama from the sidelines. The rest of you leave. Homelander, stay. The sound of chair legs scraping against the carpet echoed throughout the conference room. Translucent was the first to stand, quickly turning invisible and slipping away. The Deep followed closely behind, his head lowered, looking rather upset. When A-Train turned his wheelchair, a wheel slammed into a table leg with a dull thud, prompting him to mutter a low curse. Ashley scurried out right behind them. Maeve was the last to leave. Her steps paused slightly as she passed Benjamin's side, casting a quick glance at him before swiftly exiting. The conference room door slammed shut heavily behind her. Less than greater than. Benjamin turned around to face his son. Homelander stood beside the head of the long table, his cape draping quietly behind him. His arms had shifted from being crossed over his chest to hanging down at his sides. The previous posture of standing with crossed arms and watching coldly was gone, replaced by a stance that even he wasn't quite used to. Because everyone else had been reprimanded, leaving him entirely alone in the room. Will father lecture me? Homelander thought to himself. Benjamin picked his shield up off the table, its metal edge clicking lightly against the rim. He hung the shield onto the back of a nearby chair, pulled that chair out, and sat down. He raised his hand, pointing his index finger at an adjacent chair. Sit. Homelander hesitated for less than a second. Then he sat down. He didn't lean against the backrest. Instead, he straightened his spine, placing his hands properly on his knees, his 10 fingertips just resting on the edges of his suit's knee armor. His cape was pressed behind him, draping through the gap between the chair cushion and the backrest, piling into a small pool of red on the carpet. Benjamin found the posture mildly amusing. The stance felt somewhat familiar. In reality, he had rarely seen Homelander sit like this. In his memory, Homelander either crossed his legs, leaned back against the chair to strike a condescending, lazy pose, or simply stood, staring down at others with those blue eyes, a smirk of effortless superiority permanently etched on his face. But right now, Homelander's posture, knees together, hands flat, spine straight, was no different from a 10-year-old kid sitting in the principal's office waiting to be scolded. An image flashed through his mind. In Season 5 of the original show, his original body took Homelander to find Marathon. Back then, Homelander wore his suit but sat on the sofa, hands on his knees, spine perfectly straight, quietly listening to the old-timers chat. His posture was exactly like a child accompanying his father to visit an elder's house. Even when faced with Marathon's crude jokes, Homelander didn't immediately fly into a rage and kill him. He restrained himself, entirely because he was showing respect to Soldier Boy. At his core, Homelander was nothing more than a child. Staring at those hands resting on his knees, Benjamin suddenly realized something. The man in front of him didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't do drugs, and didn't frequent prostitutes. He had zero vices. From a certain angle, he could even be considered a moral role model in the superhero community. A model citizen, well, aside from his fondness for murdering people. Granted, his penchant for murder was a problem larger than all of his virtues combined. But he was still a child. A child who, after being tortured in a lab by Vought, was plucked out and thrown straight into the spotlight, never having had the chance to truly grow up. Chapter 15. If only all of this were real. Benjamin looked at him, falling silent for a moment. The sunlight streaming through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows hit Homelander's blonde hair, looking quite beautiful. Homelander was a bit nervous. Then Benjamin spoke. "John," he said, "are you wondering why I'm making such a big deal out of petty shit like a train running someone over and translucent peeping?" Homelander's eyes flickered slightly. He didn't speak, but his silence itself was an answer. Yes, he really was thinking about that. He didn't understand why his father was making such a massive fuss over trivial bullshit. What was the big deal about running someone over? What was the big deal about taking a little peek? They were superheroes. Superheroes were supposed to have superhero immunity. At least, that was what his entire upbringing had taught him. He had done plenty of terrible things to ordinary people, but Vought had never told him it was wrong. Benjamin leaned back against his chair. The look he gave Homelander turned into disappointment. "You're supposed to be fucking superheroes," Benjamin said, disappointed. "But you're so goddamn pathetic. So pathetic it's hard to fucking believe. The Seven, the top superhero team in America, the elite of the elite selected through multiple rounds of screening from all the soups across the country, 1 in a million talents. And the result? One dopes himself up and runs through people, one peeps in bathrooms, one fucks dolphins, and another spends all day brooding in silence until my son shoves a hand right through his chest. This is the top team in America. It's so fucking disappointing." He gestured with his hands spread open. "How the hell did you all end up more pathetic and pussy than the last?" His gaze pierced straight through Homelander's blue eyes. "And you, John, my son, the most powerful soup on earth. Your problem, in my eyes, is bigger than all of theirs combined." Homelander's expression froze. The last remaining trace of a smirk vanished from the corner of his mouth, his lips pressing into a hard line. He looked aggrieved. This was genuine, unadulterated grievance. Like a child publicly called out by a teacher in class, after every single classmate had been chewed out, the teacher singled him out alone just to tell him, "Your problem is the biggest." The kid wanted to fight back, wanted to say it wasn't fair, wanted to say those people did things way worse than him, but he didn't talk back, because deep down, he vaguely knew his father might be right. Benjamin stood up, walked over to Homelander, reared back his arm, and punched him on the shoulder. It carried nowhere near the force of the punch on the rooftop, but it was enough to sting. Homelander's shoulder flinched back, his hand rising to clutch the spot. He looked up at Benjamin, his brow furrowed, his expression devoid of anger, only confusion and an even deeper sense of grievance. "From now on, all Compound V circulating on the black market stops completely," Benjamin said. "I don't want a single soup terrorist showing up in America, no, in any country across the entire globe. I've already cleared this with Edgar, and he agreed. And even if he hadn't, he wouldn't have had a choice." Homelander clutched his shoulder, remaining silent. Compound V, that was Vought's lifeblood, the ultimate driving force behind the entire operation from the foundation to the top floor of the tower. Superheroes were the product, and Compound V was the production line. Cutting off black market distribution and halting the creation of soup terrorists would lower the demand for superheroes, meaning a massive hit to Vought's profits. He parted his lips, wanting to say something about Vought's interests, about how Edgar and the board would react. But then he thought about how Vought had treated him and his father. Selling Soldier Boy to the Russians, torturing him for 40 years. Plucking him out of the incubation tank, subjecting him to relentless experimentation and torture. Why should he defy his own father's orders for the sake of Vought? Homelander's eyes cleared up, he swallowed his words back down. But in truth, his confusion hadn't vanished. What actual harm did the appearance of those soup terrorists cause him or Soldier Boy? What did the deaths of ordinary people have to do with them? He didn't quite get it, but he chose not to ask. Not out of fear, but because asking might make him look stupid. And maybe get him punched by his father again. There was one more thing. Homelander also wasn't sure if Soldier Boy was doing this purely to undermine Vought's interests, or if he was genuinely a good guy. A good guy with a foul mouth. Benjamin looked at him, leaning down once more with his hands on his knees, bringing his gaze level with the seated Homelander. The gesture felt like a genuine conversation between two people at the exact same eye level. Homelander looked at the soldier boy in front of him. Listen, John, you're a fucking superhero. No, you're the most powerful fucking superhero in the world. We don't exist for Vought, and we don't exist to perform some scripted dynamic in front of the cameras. We exist to protect those weak, helpless pussies who can't protect themselves. Got it? Homelander's lips moved slightly. In his entire life, no one had ever said these words to him. Madeline taught him brand value. Edgar taught him to weigh pros and cons. PR taught him how to deliver lines with heartfelt sincerity on camera. No one had ever told him that his very existence was meant to protect ordinary people without superpowers. I know you're a good boy, John. Benjamin straightened up, extending a hand to pat Homelander gently on the shoulder. You're not a bad guy. You just never had anyone teach you the right things growing up. It's not too late to fix it now. Good boy. The way the words came out of Benjamin's mouth was entirely different from the sterile, printed praise on Vought's PR sheets. Homelander lowered his head, staring at his hands on his knees. Benjamin stood up and suggested, "It's getting late. How about coming down to the cafeteria to grab some dinner with me?" Homelander looked up. Having dinner with his father, the phrase was as foreign to him as the molecular formula of compound V, yet it held far more weight than any perfect script cooked up by PR. All right, he stood up, falling in behind Benjamin. Homelander followed behind Soldier Boy through the corridor, his cape swaying gently behind him. When the elevator doors opened, Benjamin stepped in first. Homelander followed, turning around to stand properly. The two stood side by side against the mirrored walls of the elevator. One in a deep green suit, one in a red cape, similar height, matching silhouettes. Homelander stared at the two side-by-side reflections in the mirror, suddenly remembering something. There was a shoot scheduled for next week. Vought PR had handed him a new script. He hadn't read through the whole thing yet, but he knew the general gist. He was supposed to stand in a warm, nostalgic old house and introduce his family to the camera. Introduce his grandparents, his mom and dad. The script specified that his mother would play a soft tune on the piano every night. There had to be a real, vintage piano in the room, with a few meticulously aged family photos resting on the lid. And his father, the script laid it out in detail, was supposed to sit beside him at a workbench, building a model airplane together. The exact moment he received the script, he had thought, if only all of this were real. Not a stage set, not some temporary house thrown together by crew members, and certainly not some broken piano and artificially aged photos dug out of the prop department by PR. But a real, existing, ordinary family. But right now, standing in the elevator, Homelander looked at the profile of the man in the deep green suit beside him. His father was real. He threw punches, patted shoulders, and said words like, "You're a good boy. Can I grab dinner with you every day? I mean, if you're free. Of course, if you're busy, I can just eat by myself," Homelander asked, shrugging his shoulders slightly to pretend he didn't care. Chapter 16. Physical stats enhanced again. Benjamin and Homelander sat face to face, drinking cola and eating burgers and fried chicken while a notification chime rang in his ears. Ding. You have made Homelander feel the heavy weight of a loving father's affection. Homelander has never eaten a meal with his family, nor has he ever been told by a family member that he's a good boy. He will always remember that, "Good boy, you just said." Reward acquired. Super Strength LV5 upgraded to LV6. Current abilities. Nuclear Energy Blast LV3 can release high-intensity radioactive energy capable of incinerating anything and burning away the compound V inside a target's body. Super Strength LV6 possesses the top-tier super strength of elite supes. Super Defense LV5 invulnerable, immune to conventional firearms and most sup attacks. Self-Healing LV5 extremely high cellular activity, capable of rapidly repairing fatal wounds. Radiation Resistance LV5 completely immune to nuclear radiation and all harmful rays. Super Speed LV1 possesses the speed of a standard sup. Eternal Youth physical form permanently remains at its peak. Benjamin hadn't expected the reward to be this generous this time. Perhaps it was because Homelander had genuinely felt the heavy weight of family affection. His strength was already on par with Homelander's, maybe even slightly greater, and now that it had reached LV6, he had absolutely become even more powerful. Benjamin felt a surge of raw power coursing through his entire body. This feeling of growing stronger was undeniably satisfying. Unfortunately, Benjamin would have preferred to acquire super speed or super flight to cover his major shortcomings. Although he wouldn't get run circles around by a rental bike anymore, a regular sedan could still easily outpace him. Soldier Boy's current speed was probably just a bit faster than an ordinary human's. He wasn't entirely sure himself. Less than greater than. Unlike Soldier Boy's idle thoughts, Homelander was currently using his straw to poke at the ice cubes in his cup, making them clink gently against the cola. During the meal, he glanced at Benjamin several times. Back in the elevator, Benjamin had just agreed, saying, "Isn't eating with family exactly what you're supposed to do?" At the thought of this, the straw in Homelander's hand slipped, hitting the bottom of the cup with a sharp squeak. He quickly adjusted the straw and lowered his head to take a sip of cola. The soda wasn't very cold anymore, but he drank it slowly, as if using the motion to mask something, perhaps the sudden light welling up in his blue eyes. Homelander abruptly spoke up, "The chicken legs in the cafeteria are a little salty." Benjamin snorted. "Then tell the kitchen to use less goddamn salt next time. Do I really have to handle every petty little detail?" Homelander's expression twitched slightly, he was still caught up in his emotions. Just then, the smartphone in Benjamin's pocket, the one he'd been using for less than a week, began to buzz. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a news push, a CNN breaking headline, with a glaring red, "Breaking News" banner stretching across the top of the screen. His gaze lingered on the headline for a brief moment before he turned the phone toward Homelander to show him. The screen read, "Starlight to join the Seven. Vought announces welcome banquet tonight, rising star Annie January to make her official debut." Starlight was coming. Tonight. Homelander glanced at the screen, his expression unshifting. He had known about Starlight joining the Seven long ago, of course. "This decision was finalized before you became executive director, but obviously, if you don't like the new member, we can kick her off," Homelander quickly explained. He didn't understand why Benjamin cared. Perhaps it was because Starlight's addition hadn't gone through his approval. Shoving his phone back into his pocket, Benjamin picked up his tray and stood up. "Doesn't matter. Just don't let it happen again. And generally speaking, aside from today, I won't interfere too much with the day-to-day trivialities of the Seven. You're still the captain of the team." Benjamin, of course, had no intention of kicking Starlight out, he still had to bully the Deep tonight. Less than greater than. After finishing their meal, the two split up by the elevators. Homelander went to handle the Compound V matter, while Benjamin took the elevator up to his new domain, which in less than a day was already being referred to as the Office of the Returned Legend. The office Vought had assigned him was located on the 56th floor of the building, designated specifically for the executive director of superhuman affairs. Pushing open the door, describing the site inside as merely luxurious would be an understatement. The entire office was nearly the size of a two-bedroom apartment. A massive curved floor-to-ceiling window directly faced the Hudson River. At this moment, the final glow of twilight was slowly fading from the river's surface, bathing the room in a palette of interlocking dark gold and deep blue tones. The desk was a solid piece of polished black walnut, massive enough to hold a tactical planning meeting on. Resting on its surface were the latest Vought customized tablet, a set of paper documents, and a nameplate embossed with gilded letters, Executive Director of Superhuman Affairs. Those words signified that Soldier Boy's control over Supes was absolute, his status ranking definitively above Madeline's. Less than greater than. Meanwhile, deep beneath Vought Tower, at the Compound V Storage and Management Center. Homelander stood before a row of temperature-controlled storage cabinets glowing with a cold blue fluorescence, the hem of his cape dragging along the epoxy floor, casting a dark red reflection. Standing in front of him were two technical directors in white lab coats, a tall, lanky man wearing glasses, and a short, stout man whose hairline had receded to the top of his head. Both were trembling to varying degrees. The thin one's knees were shaking, while the fat one's hands trembled as he held his tablet. "Shut down all black market distribution channels completely. From today on, send me a copy of the warehouse inventory logs every single day." But Mr. Homelander, the lanky man pushed up his glasses, "if we completely cut off the black market channels, the board of directors." "Are you saying," Homelander turned his head, flashing him a smile, "that you want to debate the board's opinions with me?" The lanky man's glasses slipped down the bridge of his nose. "No, sir. No objections." shutting it down completely. We'll close them today. Homelander patted him on the shoulder. The force wasn't heavy, but the lanky man's knees visibly buckled. Good, I like efficient people. Homelander wondered if he was picking up his father's habit of patting people on the shoulder. Soon enough, A-Train also received the news. He was actually confused at first, but quickly realized that this was likely Soldier Boy's command. A-Train let out a sigh. Since he no longer needed to run errands for Homelander, would he still be able to skim any more Compound V? Thinking about the upcoming race made A-Train incredibly anxious. Fortunately, he still had a decent amount of personal stash left over. Chapter 17. Berating the Deep in Starlight. Night. The banquet hall of Vought Tower was brilliantly illuminated. Ivory white tablecloths covered the long tables, silver utensils were meticulously arranged, and every single dish was personally crafted by a Michelin-starred chef. Massive posters of the Seven hung on both sides of the walls, Homelander's iconic smile looking exceptionally dazzling under the lights. And, of course, Soldier Boy's poster was right there too. The posters of Soldier Boy and Homelander were positioned in the center, side by side. However, Soldier Boy's new position hadn't been made public yet, it wasn't the right time. Annie January, codenamed Starlight, stood at the entrance of the banquet hall in her custom gold suit and took a deep breath. A thin layer of sweat still broke out in her palms. After all, this was the most important night of her life. Starting tonight, she was no longer Annie the small-town girl, but Starlight of the Seven. During the banquet, Starlight met a lot of people and caught sight of Soldier Boy appearing in the hall. Starlight froze for a moment. She recognized that face, of course. Anyone in America who had ever turned on a television recognized that face. Soldier Boy, America's hero, a founding pillar of Vought, the man carrying a shield and storming through a hail of bullets in black and white documentaries. The history books said he had tragically sacrificed his life, but he had returned to Vought just this morning. To say Starlight wasn't excited would be a total lie. Unlike the original timeline, where his original self blasted half a street due to a PTSD episode and genuinely killed quite a few people, earning Starlight's loathing, he wouldn't suffer from any outbursts now. Benjamin wasn't the old Soldier Boy. From across half the banquet hall, Benjamin caught her eye and gave a slight nod. Receiving encouragement from such a legendary predecessor made Starlight even happier. The Deep stood right next to Starlight, waving continuously to the crowd below. Less than greater than. The banquet lasted for 2 hours. After the final dessert was cleared, the guests gradually dispersed, reporters packed up their equipment, and fans were guided out of the venue by staff. The Deep then took Starlight to see the Seven's conference room. She followed the Deep toward the elevator at the end of the corridor. The conference room doors shut behind them. Starlight sized up this legendary place where the Seven held their meetings. When the Deep asked Starlight if there was a portrait of Homelander in the room, Starlight shook her head, saying her idol was actually the Deep, and that she used to be his fangirl. The Deep quickly broke into a grin, but when Starlight turned back around, her expression turned to sheer horror. The idol of her dreams, the Deep, now wore a greasy smile. He had dropped his pants and was arching an eyebrow at Starlight. Starlight's pupils contracted violently as she turned to leave. "What's wrong? Didn't you just say you're obsessed with me?" The Deep spread his hands, looking confused. Still, Starlight prepared to flee. Hey, this is about how badly you want to be in the Seven. I'm the number 2 guy around here." Right as the Deep was delivering his smug threat, there was a loud crash. The door lock was violently busted open, the fragments of the lock cylinder bouncing twice on the carpet before rolling to the Deep's feet. A figure in a deep green suit stood in the doorway, the shield strapped to his left arm. The face that would never fade from the black and white documentaries now wore a mocking sneer. "What a coincidence," Benjamin said. "I just happened to be passing by and heard someone claiming to be the number 2 guy in the Seven, getting ready to put his hands on a female rookie who just joined." With his hands still on his waistband, the Deep froze in place, the greasy look on his face instantly morphing into pure panic. He opened his mouth to explain, wanting to say it was a tradition in the Seven, that plenty of people went through this before joining, that it was just a joke. But he didn't have the time. "The thing I fucking despise most is using sleazy tactics like this to threaten a lady. You're an absolute joke of a coward," Benjamin snarled, then brought his fist straight down onto the bridge of his nose. Instantly, an overwhelming force slammed into him, sending the Deep flying. The sickening crunch of shattering bone mingled with the Deep's agonizing shriek as it exploded through the conference room. Clutching his gushing nose, the Deep crashed through 2 chairs by the long table before collapsing onto the carpet. Benjamin strode over, planting his combat boot firmly onto the Deep's head. Leaning down, he lowered his voice to a volume only the two of them could hear. "Do you do this with your beloved fish too? Did those fish say yes?" "Huh." Benjamin's tone was as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "You think this is an aquarium? This is dry land, and dry land belongs to me." The Deep wailed in agony, his body convulsing on the floor as blood gushed from his face, staining his suit. Starlight stood in the corner of the room, her fingers trembling. Watching the Deep on the floor, watching the man who had tried to put his hands on her just minutes ago now curled into a bloody heap on the carpet, a wave of pure satisfaction washed over her. An asshole like this deserved a beating. If your mother were standing right in front of me, maybe I'd show you exactly how I break her, letting her thoroughly enjoy what you were planning to do to Starlight. Starlight blinked. The way this man spoke was absolutely brutal. "I'm sorry, sir. I was wrong. I'm really, really sorry," the Deep begged. "I know I fucked up. Please spare my life." Benjamin lifted his boot off the Deep's head and turned his gaze toward Starlight. Somewhat at a loss, Starlight looked up at the man who had just stepped right out of her history textbooks, momentarily dazed. But soon, she murmured softly, "Thank you, sir. You have all these superpowers, yet you let a useless piece of shit who only fucks fish threaten you. You're a pathetic, spineless broad too," Benjamin barked. Turning on his heel, he walked out of the conference room, pausing at the threshold to cast a backward glance at the crumpled Deep. "Starting right now, a piece of trash like you is off the 7. But when the Deep heard those words, the color drained from his face even faster than when that fist the size of a sandbag had smashed into his nose. "No, please." The Deep regretted it deeply. Clearly, he had been the one getting bullied in the beginning. How come when it was his turn to bully someone else, it wasn't allowed? Starlight, meanwhile, was still dwelling on the word Soldier Boy had just used to insult her. Abroad? Wait, wasn't she abroad? She opened her mouth, completely at a loss for words. Chapter 18. I'm proud of him. Late night, Vought Tower, Madeline Stillwell's private office. Mayor Steve of Baltimore sat dead center on the leather sofa. Madeline sat opposite him, the hem of her skirt neatly pressed beneath her knees, a standard professional smile plastered on her face. $300 million a year for an exclusive contract with Nubian Prince, her voice was gentle. Baltimore's crime rate is at an all-time high. Your constituents need a superhero. The mayor sipped his whiskey and set the glass on the armrest of the sofa. I know about Compound V. Madeline's smile didn't waver, but her fingers paused on the armrest. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do, the mayor said confidently, leaning back into the sofa with a certain smirk. $200 million a year. Otherwise, this report hits the front page of the Washington Post tomorrow morning. Madeline looked down at the envelope on the coffee table. The office fell dead silent for 5 full seconds. I'll consider your proposal. The mayor stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and strode out of the office. The door clicked shut behind him. Madeline tossed the envelope into the shredder. A moment later, she placed a call to the mayor, negotiating a mutually agreeable price. Less than greater than. Not far away, having overheard the conversation through his superhearing, Homelander's eyes flared with anger. His blue eyes turned ice cold. A mayor, a petty municipal official, daring to threaten Vought and Madeline with nothing but a few printed sheets of paper. His default line of thinking was exactly what it had always been: fly over and use his heat vision to slice that plane clean in half. Quick and neat. Yet, he stopped. An image flashed through his mind. Soldier Boy standing in the conference room, stating flatly, "We exist to protect those weak, helpless pussies." His father had been sold out by Vought for 40 years. Vought used Compound V to manufacture soup terrorists, then deployed superheroes to stop them just to turn a profit. Why the hell should he keep murdering people for Vought's sake? Homelander slowly straightened his knees, his cape dropping still behind him as the snapping wind died down. He looked down at the myriad of lights from the New York skyline below. The lights somehow looked different than before. After staring for a moment, Homelander stepped away from the window. Forget it, he wasn't going. Outside the window, the New York night sky remained as quiet as ever. No red cape streaked across the horizon, and no scorching laser tracks tore through the clouds. The mayor's plane touched down smoothly at some airport, leaving the mayor and his son completely oblivious to the fact that they had just brushed past death. Less than greater than. In Vought Tower, the lights in the office of the executive director of Superhuman Affairs were still burning. Starlight stood at the doorway, having changed out of her gold suit into a simple white shirt and jeans, clutching a bottle of champagne she had brought out from the banquet hall. Her blonde hair fell loosely over her shoulders. Benjamin looked up from behind his desk, glancing at the liquor in her hand. "Come in. Soldier boy, I came to thank you," Starlight said as she walked in, placing the bottle on the coffee table. About what happened in the conference room tonight. Though his choice of words had been incredibly brutal, he had still protected her. Starlight knew she had to show her gratitude. "Save the thank yous. It's late as hell, and you still have time to buy goddamn champagne." Starlight looked a bit embarrassed but still left the bottle on the desk. "Is this just how Soldier Boy talks?" Benjamin poured the champagne into a glass. After a brief pause, he continued, "He thinks he's exercising some sort of birthright, so let this be a reminder to you, there's more than just one asshole like that in Vought. But I'm relatively sane. If you have any issues, come find me. After all, I'm the boss of the 7 now, and the whole team, including my pussy son, answers to me." "Sir, Homelander is actually your son." Starlight was utterly shell-shocked. This piece of news hadn't been leaked to the media yet. Even though he's a bit of a pussy, has a garbage personality, and gets easily unhinged when things happen, he's still undeniably the strongest soup in America. "I'm proud of him," Benjamin said, taking a sip of champagne, his face ridden with genuine pride. Not far away, Homelander, using his super hearing, overheard Benjamin praising him. "You too, I'm just like you, the strongest soup in America," Homelander murmured to himself. "Less than greater than." Starlight lowered her head, falling silent for a moment. "Sir, I used to think joining the 7 was my dream. Now I'm not so sure if this dream is what I imagined it to be." "There's nothing wrong with the dream. It's this fucking place that doesn't deserve it." Benjamin took another sip of champagne and set his glass back on the table. "But you can make this place deserve it." Starlight looked up at him. The man who had walked straight out of the black and white photos of her history textbooks spoke completely differently from every other Vought executive she had ever met. No corporate promises, no motivational vitriol, and no talk about brand value or follower growth curves. His words were a bit coarse and incredibly blunt, but they were real. She smiled. "Thank you, and not just for tonight." Benjamin said nothing, merely lifting his glass slightly in response. Starlight stared at Benjamin's handsome face, briefly losing herself in thought. Less than greater than. Early the next morning, Vought's HR department issued 2 notices with record-breaking efficiency. The first was public. The Deep had resigned from his position as a member of the 7 due to personal reasons, effective immediately. Within 10 minutes, the PR department drafted a farewell statement highlighting his outstanding contributions to marine conservation and the lingering injuries he sustained from long-term crime fighting. At the end, they appended a personal reflection from the Deep, written with heartfelt sincerity. Of course, the Deep himself hadn't penned a single word of it. Dragging his suitcase, the Deep walked out of Vought Tower's side exit, medical tape plastered over his nose and deep purple bruises blossoming across both cheekbones. He tried to mask it with a baseball cap and sunglasses. Standing by the curb, the Deep glanced back up at Vought Tower, a place he once thought held his glory. Letting out a sigh, he yanked open a car door and slid into the back seat of a taxi. The door slammed shut heavily, and the taxi merged into the peak Manhattan morning traffic. Fortunately, though he was kicked off the 7, he was still employed by Vought International, and Madeline had assured him that there would be opportunities for a comeback down the line, depending on his performance. Naturally, it was just corporate lip service. Benjamin couldn't be bothered to care about such trivial matters, he simply found the Deep repulsive. Of course, if the Deep actually managed to turn over a new leaf and stop being so sleazy, Benjamin wouldn't mind letting him come back. Less than greater than. In the afternoon, Huey arrived at Vought. Huey had come anyway to collect a settlement, since a train had nearly run his girlfriend over. Inside the elevator, when Benjamin crossed paths with Huey, he noticed the kid was visibly sweating. "What the hell is a pussy like you doing at Vought out of nowhere?" Benjamin asked, playing dumb. Huey looked a bit embarrassed and replied, "I'm here to receive a settlement from Vought. Take the cash and go live your life. After all, you and that girlfriend of yours who was almost turned into minced meat are still drawing breath, aren't you?" Huey nodded. "I will, sir. And thank you again for saving my girlfriend's life back then." Benjamin patted Huey on the shoulder. Even though he kept the force incredibly light, it still made Huey wince and grit his teeth. Benjamin had no idea how much of his advice Huey would actually take to heart. Maybe he'd listen, maybe he wouldn't, and he'd still end up getting tangled up with that cuckold butcher. Still, aside from despising that cuckold's rhetoric, Benjamin didn't actually hate the boys. In fact, if he wanted to topple Vought and bring down Edgar, he could easily make use of them. After all, Benjamin wasn't much stronger than the original Soldier Boy, just a bit more durable and slightly faster. He didn't know for certain if Vought had a hidden failsafe designed to neutralize him and Homelander. Of course, even without the boys, Homelander would inevitably take over Vought sooner or later. Making use of the boys might just speed up the process. Less than greater than. Early the next morning, Translucent went missing. A grown-up, invulnerable superhero had suddenly vanished into thin air. Vought and everyone else didn't pay it much mind at first, since Translucent frequently went invisible to sneak off and mess around elsewhere. Sitting behind his desk, Benjamin picked up his first cup of morning coffee. The plot had officially begun. Yesterday, Huey and Butcher had already made contact and kidnapped Translucent. Chapter 19. The Plan Against Soldier Boy. Benjamin sat in his office, took a sip of his coffee, and looked at a newly created file on his tablet. It was regarding Huey, Butcher, Frenchie, and Mother's Milk. Not a single one of the four was missing. Honestly, Benjamin had originally thought that if Robin didn't die, Huey wouldn't walk down this path. But he was still involved, which didn't make much sense. Now Translucent had vanished. No sign of life, no body found, and no one across Vought International was investigating or asking questions. And as for whether Translucent was dead or alive, truth be told, it didn't have a damn thing to do with him. Forget it, Benjamin didn't intend to interfere. In his eyes, Translucent's life or death wasn't even as important as those beautiful, sexy female characters. Less than greater than. The bottom floor of Vought Tower, Stan Edgar's private conference room. No windows, acoustic panels on all four walls, and all electronic devices were left in a shielded locker outside the door. Here, they could ensure that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by Homelander. Several core board directors sat around the long table, with Madeline sitting to Edgar's right. The lighting was dim. Get straight to the conclusion, Edgar's voice was completely devoid of emotion. The losses since Soldier Boy took office. Madeline opened her tablet. The Compound V black market has been shut down, with projected profits dropping by 23%. The Deep has been fired, reducing revenue from his IP merchandise to zero. That's a loss of at least $800 million. Furthermore, due to that previous incident, 3 of Atrain's sponsors are negotiating to terminate their contracts. She paused, then continued, Soldier Boy has no weaknesses. He doesn't care about money, maybe isn't even into women, and has no personality flaws. He won't care about his reputation the way Homelander does. We can't find any leverage. And because Soldier Boy is Homelander's father, Homelander doesn't resent Soldier Boy for having greater authority than him. A silence fell over the conference table. A white-haired director took off his glasses. What about Homelander? If Madeline can keep a tight grip on him, it could at least create some sort of balance, which might be better than Homelander holding total dominance like before. Madeline set down her water glass, her movement half a beat slower than usual. Edgar spoke up on her behalf. Over the past 2 days, Homelander hasn't gone to Madeline for milk. Their relationship appears to have fractured since Soldier Boy's arrival. Why? Because Soldier Boy is his father. Madeline's voice was dry. When someone who has been starved of affection his entire life suddenly has a biological father drop out of the sky, who do you think he's going to choose? Perhaps, Madeline, you can give Homelander more love than Soldier Boy can. Soldier Boy doesn't have milk. Madeline rubbed her temples, not knowing what would be best to say. Silence pressed down once more. The second hand on the wall clock ticked around 3 times before someone finally spoke. Soldier Boy can't be killed, but he can be contained. The Russians managed it back then. You mean, he'll have to leave Vought Tower eventually. The members of Payback are still around, except for Black Noir. Them, plus a few compliant soups. We pick a time when he goes out alone, ambush him, control him, and lock him away. Just like back then. Several gazes shifted toward Edgar simultaneously. Edgar didn't answer immediately. He stared at the desktop, and after a long moment, he looked up. A two-pronged approach, his voice carried no inflection. Madeline, satisfy Homelander as much as possible, pull him back. Whatever he wants, give it to him, placate him. As for the other side, he looked at the director who had made the suggestion. Reach out to Payback. They'll follow Vought's arrangements. They despise Soldier Boy. Have them on standby. Madeline nodded. She knew full well that winning over Homelander used to require nothing more than a glance, or maybe pulling down her collar. But now, it had transformed into a task demanding she satisfy his every request as much as possible. But she had no other cards left to play. Yet Madeline didn't know what to do either. Aside from certain parts of her own anatomy, what else could she even offer? But soon, Madeline thought of Soldier Boy. Could she use the same method she used to seduce Homelander to seduce? The meeting adjourned. The directors filed out one by one, leaving only Edgar sitting alone at the end of the long table. He let out a sigh. Soldier Boy's return had certainly caused a fair share of trouble, and he apparently intended to be a real superhero. Vought didn't need real superheroes. Vought only needed compliant products. Chapter 20. Madeline's Manipulation. When Madeline pushed open the door to Homelander's room, he was sitting on the sofa. Seeing Madeline enter, Homelander said coldly, "Get out. You haven't come to see me for 2 days. You haven't even looked at me." Madeline's voice drifted from the doorway, carrying a perfectly calibrated trace of plaintiveness. She shut the door, her high heels clacking against the marble floor with an unhurried rhythm. It was her usual style, always in control, always composed. But tonight, there was something else lurking in her eyes, unease, and calculation. There was also anxiety, meticulously disguised as tenderness. Homelander looked up, his expression somewhat complicated. He parted his lips but didn't know what to say. Madeline, his handler, the woman closest to the word mother in his entire life. Right now, Madeline stood before him, dressed in a sharply tailored dark blue suit. The neckline was wide, revealing a deep cleavage. Homelander's eyes drifted toward it. He opened his mouth, his thoughts completely unreadable. Homelander. Madeline sat down next to him, her chest pressing close to him as she reached out to touch his face. "What's wrong, Homelander?" Homelander shifted half an inch to the side, evading her hand. The movement was minute, but Madeline's fingers froze in midair, as if hitting an invisible wall. "You and Edgar," Homelander's voice was much lower than usual. "In Vought International, you hurt Soldier Boy." No, my baby." Madeline shook her head, her expression near innocent in its sincerity. "At the time, I just thought Soldier Boy was a soup terrorist. I didn't know he was your father, I really didn't. What happened to him, all those things. I had no idea. But when I went to check his files earlier," Homelander said, staring dead into her eyes, "you blocked me." His gaze was filled with fury, he was no longer looking at her cleavage. The room fell dead silent, the low hum of the air conditioner suddenly becoming glaringly distinct. Madeline looked at him, then suddenly made a move he hadn't anticipated at all. She leaned in, opened her arms, and wrapped him in a tight embrace, pulling him completely against her. Madeline was actually incredibly tense. She had no idea if Homelander was still under her control, but she knew this was her only option. For Vought. Shifting her position, Madeline rested her chin against the top of his head, letting him press back against her chest. Homelander froze, his hands hanging limply at his sides, entirely unsure of where to put them. "It's all my fault," Madeline whispered, her breath brushing against his ear, carrying a barely perceptible tremor. "I didn't know anything back then, baby. If I'd known he was your father, I never would have done it. Forgive me, okay, my baby." Homelander's Adam's apple bobbed. He glanced up at her chest again. He wanted to say something, but the days of accumulated fury and grievance inside his chest suddenly lost their outlet within Madeline's embrace. Her hand began to gently stroke his back. "You haven't come to see me for 2 days. Are you never coming back?" As Homelander's head leaned closer, Madeline pulled back slightly, cupping his face in her hands and gently stroking his cheeks with her thumbs. "I wait for you every single day. Do you know that? Every day, baby." Homelander stared into her eyes, his lips parting slightly. Madeline pressed her advantage. "Trust me." Her fingers slid from the corner of his eye down to his cheek. "I've never lied to you, baby. All of those things were Edgar's decisions. I was just executing them for him. I really didn't know anything about your father back then." She leaned even closer, her forehead practically pressed against his. "Let me make it up to you, okay? Just like we used to. You can have Soldier Boy's love, and you can still have my love, can't you?" Homelander's breathing grew ragged. He knew Madeline might be lying. But he couldn't resist it. His super hearing could clearly pick up her heartbeat, it was abnormally fast. In the past, Madeline would explain that it was racing out of passion, but there was another distinct possibility: she was terrified. Was she driven by passion right now, or was it fear? Homelander didn't know. Everything that had happened over the last few days, his father's return, being denied the files, Black Noir's death, those half-true conversations in the office, it all tangled together, tightening the psychological cord in his brain until it was on the verge of snapping. Yet right now, Madeline's warmth was real. Her breath was real. That familiar scent radiating from her was real. "Don't push me away," Madeline whispered, her fingers sliding to the back of his neck, gently guiding his head down onto her shoulder. Homelander's eyelids drooped, the resistance within his body eroding piece by piece. But then, his father's insult flashed through his mind: pussy. He didn't want to be a pussy. He refused to be manipulated by anyone ever again, he refused to be anyone's tool. He was Homelander, the most powerful soup on the planet. Yet Madeline's arms were still wrapped securely around his neck. Homelander's fists clenched tight. An instant later, a deafening crash shattered the silence. The door was kicked open. The heavy metal slab ripped entirely off its hinges, flying across the room and slamming into the opposite wall with a thunderous roar. Madeline shrieked, instantly releasing Homelander. Homelander bolted to his feet, his pupils violently dilating. A tall, silent silhouette framed the doorway. Clad in his deep green suit, his shield wasn't gripped in his hand but slung at his left side, its metallic edge catching the harsh corridor lighting and throwing off a cold glint. Benjamin, soldier boy, stood at the threshold, taking in the scene on the sofa. He didn't make a single aggressive movement. No roaring, no interrogation, he didn't even step inside the room. He simply stood there, fixing Homelander with an utterly clinical glare. Benjamin had known Madeline was up to something for a while now. When he passed by just moments ago, her getup reminded him of a washed-up old whore. It was fucking repulsive. If you want to read ahead and find out what happens next right away, you can get up to 20 chapters ahead on my P@TR, on patreon.com/forgottendaoist, @=A, link is in my profile. To be continued.